We're going to get started. Thank you all for being here. Um, we're here today to learn about open data licensing and Creative Commons. So hopefully you are in the right place. My name is Shanna Hollich. I'm the Learning and Training Manager here at Creative Commons. I'm coming to you today from Pennsylvania in the United States. So it's an early morning for me, but a nice day so far. I had the wonderful privilege of spending a few days in Tallinn in 2023 in January. So there was lots of snow and ice, which I actually liked. I come from a winter climate, so I was very happy to be there in the winter. But I don't think very many tourists show up in January. I was there with an orchestra doing a tour. We did a lovely performance with the students at the Tallinn School of Music and Ballet, and it was very nice. So I have spent a few days in Estonia. It was beautiful, and I'm glad you all can be here today. Um, I'm hoping you all have access to the chat. We're going to use the meeting chat. That's where you will be asking questions. If you have comments or would like to share some experiences that you've had during your work, I highly encourage that in the chat. I know I was told when I was in Estonia that folks are perhaps not as outgoing as we tend to be in America. But I do hope you'll feel comfortable sharing your own thoughts and ideas today and asking lots and lots of questions. We will have lots of time for your questions. In fact, I'd like to start today with just some brief introductions. So in the Teams chat window, if you would please tell us your name, your job title, and what type of work you do, and one thing you hope to learn in today's training. So if you could just type that in the chat and just send it whenever you're ready, it'll give us a good idea of who's in the room with us today. There is a note in the chat that microphones should also work for everyone, and you will have a chance to unmute your microphone and speak if you would like. For the introductions, we'll just use the chat feature. So I will also post my introduction in the chat. Right, we've got one introduction in the chat so far. Chief Software Architect, hoping to find some clarity in licensing hell. I hope that we can do that today. I understand how frustrating these things can be. Hopefully by the end of today, the Creative Commons licenses at least will be much, much more clear. Data governance in the Ministry of the Interior. Looking forward to hearing about basic principles about CC. This is great. I will also say, I am speaking English. I do not know Estonian. Frankly, I trust that your English is likely even better than mine. But as we go along, if there are any questions, if there's something that's unclear, or you're not sure of a phrase or a word that I use, also let me know in the chat. I'm happy to explain things in different ways. Also because we're going to start talking about copyright, because the CC licenses work hand in hand with copyright, and there's some technical words in there that may or may not translate easily. Great. Some folks who have just started working with open data, arranging and publishing it. People, a data engineer wanting to learn more about different types of licenses, basics about CC licensing. This is wonderful. Practical use cases. Okay, this is great. If you have not yet put your introduction in the chat, please do. But what I'd like to do now is I actually would like to start with a discussion. I'm hoping there will be at least one or two brave people among you who will be willing to unmute and share your experiences so far. So some of you are already working with data. Some of you are pretty new to working with open data and government data. But I'm hoping you can tell me, the questions you see on your screen. What types of data and research do you want to be able to share? And why is it important that you share data and research? And what challenges have you faced when sharing data or when using data that other people have shared? So I'm going to leave a long, awkward pause here and hope that somebody will unmute and tell us a little bit about their experiences so far. I'll also note if you're more comfortable answering these questions in the chat, do feel free to do that. I know sometimes it's easier to write rather than to speak on the spot. A few more introductions came in. Some people already know about licensing, but some brushing up never hurts. I agree. Clarity for collection materials usage. Oh, a museum worker. That's lovely. Before I worked for Creative Commons, I was a librarian for the last 15 years in public libraries and academic libraries. And libraries and museums have a lot of similar needs and challenges. I will also quickly note, I am coming to you from my home today, so I will apologize in advance if you hear any cats meowing in the background. The dog is asleep, at least. But yeah, is there anyone who would like to talk a little bit about their experiences so far working with Estonia's open data portal, if you have, or using sort of openly licensed data online? Okay. I'll let you all continue to think about that and post in the chat. But it's okay. We're going to move on for now. And hopefully we'll be able to have some more questions and discussion a little bit later this afternoon. We have somebody working with open data and public data catalogs, and licenses are one of the components. Absolutely. So what we're going to do today, here's a sort of a quick agenda. This first part of the afternoon is going to be a lot of me talking. So I apologize in advance for that. But there are some groundwork we need to do before we get more specifically into data. Excuse me one moment while I close the door because of the cat. Okay, thank you. So we're going to start by talking about copyright. This will be the most technical part of the afternoon. We're kind of doing the most challenging stuff first. So I hope you're comfortable, that you have a beverage in your hand. If you do need to step away for a few seconds, that's fine. We are recording this session, so you will be able to review the recording, and I will share the slides. There are a lot of links and notes in the slides that you're viewing here that might be useful later on as resources for you. So we're going to talk about copyright a lot because that's what the CC licenses are built on. And then we'll talk about the specifics about the licenses. Then we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we will talk more about data specifically and how now we've learned about the licenses, how do they actually apply to data? There are some sort of special things to keep in mind with data. Using CC licensed works and data. And I poked around a little bit looking through Estonia's open data portal, which is a wonderful resource. You all are already a bit ahead of the game, especially compared to some of the other countries that we've worked with. So there are some things about the open data portal that I learned that might also be helpful when you're thinking about licensing. So as I said, as I'm going, do please put questions in the chat, and I can address them as I go, or some of them I might hold until the end, until the next sort of Q&A session. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with Creative Commons. That's why you're here. But just in case, Creative Commons is an international nonprofit organization. And we created these open licenses and we stored and update these licenses to allow people to open up access to their creativity, culture, research, information, education resources, and more, without infringing copyright law. We do this work because we think that sharing culture and knowledge is essential to society. It makes us better people and it helps us solve problems. So we work on policy and advocacy and training to help people learn more about how to share their work openly and provide the tools that help people do that. Yeah, like I mentioned, we believe that in order to solve the world's most pressing problems, we need to be able to share knowledge and culture. So a prime example of this is our Open Climate campaign, where we're working to make sure that climate research and climate data is as open and available as possible. There is no one scientist or researcher out there who is going to solve a problem as big as climate change. It's going to take a lot of people working together. And if they can share their knowledge openly, then they can build on that knowledge faster and better and together, so that we can solve these big complex problems. Similarly, for those of you in cultural sectors like museums or libraries, um, sharing our culture, especially globally and with folks both from within our own culture and from other cultures, is how we come together. It's how we share our humanity and how we learn more about each other and about the world. And it just makes us better people. There's a saying, uh, in English anyway, that those who do not, it's something along the lines of those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. So we need to learn about our history and culture so that we can learn from things we've done in the past to build brighter futures. So that's what CC is working to do. Um, okay, copyright. Some of you already know a lot about copyright and intellectual property law, and for some of you, this might be completely new. But before we can understand how the licenses work, we need to understand a little bit about copyright law. Um, so intellectual property, copyright is a type of intellectual property. And intellectual property law is a term that's used for legal rights that empower creators to restrict others from using their creative works. So the idea is that a long time ago in history, during the era of the printing press, all of a sudden people were able to create copies of things like books and images and artistic works um, in a way that was much more technologically easy. But this was a problem for authors. We wanted to make sure that authors and creators of these works still had incentive to create them. We wanted to make sure they were compensated financially, that they were getting credit for the work that they were doing. Because creating things takes time and labor. It's hard work, and we want to reward that work somehow. So copyright was born. And copyright is a set of exclusive rights to copyright owners, which means typically a copyright owner is the author of a work, especially in Estonian copyright law. Um, there are very few exceptions. There's a few, but there's always exceptions with copyright law. But generally, the author of a thing is the copyright owner, at least at first, which means so I created these PowerPoint slides, for example. These PowerPoint slides are a copyrighted work. I am the only person who can copy, distribute, perform, adapt, or otherwise use this work. If anybody else wants to use my slides, they need to ask me for permission. This can be difficult, right? Sometimes it's hard to find the author of a work. Sometimes you're not sure who it is. Sometimes you know who it is, but you don't know how to contact them. Sometimes you contact them and they say no. And now you can't use the thing. Um, so we discovered that there must be another way to do this. But before we get into that, a little bit more about copyright. So copyright applies to any original work of creative expression that is fixed in a tangible form. Um, the way it's worded, at least in my translation of the Estonian Copyright Act, is that it is expressed in an objective form. The idea here is that ideas, things that only live inside your head, cannot be copyrighted. You have to you have to express it in some way. You have to actually write it down or record it. It can be digital. It could be saved on a hard drive somewhere. That is a tangible or fixed or objective form. It could be on a physical piece of paper. But if it's only in your head, it doesn't exist yet in the physical world. So it needs to actually be expressed. And copyright is automatic. This is one of the big important things about copyright is that you don't have to register for it. You don't have to ask for it. You have copyright in everything that you create, whether you want it or not. Copyright is just there as soon as something is created. So as soon as I write down my notes are original work of me. They have copyright. Um, Copyright applies to most things you will think of as creative works. So books, images, photographs, videos, music, sound recordings, software, painting and graphic arts, sculpture, maps, dramatic works, speeches, lectures, sermons, um, fiction, nonfiction, science, not science, um, all of these things. There are a few things. The one thing copyright does not protect are facts and ideas. So we talked about you can't copyright an idea that only lives in your head. You have to copy, you have to express that idea in some way. Once you write it down, once you put it into words, or once you've put it into visuals in an artistic way, or put it to music, that's the copyrighted form. The basic idea is still out there for the world to use. This is why sometimes you'll see, you know, two movies come out that have very similar ideas, and you're like, how does that happen? Well, the idea is not a thing that you can protect. It's the specific way you express that idea. So if the movies are too similar, now there might be a copyright problem. But if it's just the same idea expressed in very different ways, that's okay. You also cannot copyright a fact. So the idea that 2 plus 2 equals 4, it's just a fact about the universe. You cannot copyright 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, if I express that fact in a highly creative way, so if I do a beautiful painting of a very ornate number 2 with a lot of art, and I write 2 plus 2 equals 4, the way that I expressed that fact might be copyrightable, but anyone else is perfectly free to go and say that 2 plus 2 equals 4. They might not be able to copy the specific way that I drew it, for example, but the underlying fact remains available and not copyrightable. Copyright protection lasts for a really long time. So in most countries, the term of copyright expires 50 years after the life of the author. In Estonia, it's generally the life of the author plus 70 years, which is similar to the copyright terms we have in the US. In Mexico, for example, copyright lasts even longer. It's life of the author plus 100 years. 50 is generally a minimum, but there are places with longer copyright terms. And sometimes how long copyright lasts can vary a little bit based on the type of work that it is. If there's more than one author, things can get a little tricky. But generally, things are in copyright for a long time, 70 years after the life of the author. So certainly anyone alive today has copyright in their works. So it's important to know who a copyright holder is, who has these exclusive rights, to know who to ask for permissions to get the work. And as we're going to see later, this also lets you know who can add a Creative Commons license to it. Creative Commons license is essentially just a way for a copyright holder to grant those permissions without having to be asked every single time. So we're going to talk about that in a second. Just a quick overview. A lot of the things I just talked about in copyright apply globally. So every country has its own copyright laws. In fact, I'll put some links in the chat if you are interested. The Estonian copyright law, I just put a link to it in the chat. This is the actual legal text. You know, a little light reading over coffee, if anyone's interested. Pretty much every country has its own laws, but over the years there has been a lot of global harmonization thanks to treaties and trade agreements. So the Berne Convention is a big one, and that's what set this minimum standard. You know, it's almost 200 countries have signed on to the Berne Convention and have all agreed to these sort of basics about copyright. This is why I can do trainings like this, because These international treaties have said, okay, in almost every country, copyright is automatic. Copyright lasts for a minimum of life of the author plus 50 years. There are these sorts of standard things about copyright law that apply globally, which is actually very helpful for a tool like the CC licenses. It's why they can also work globally. So yes, the Berne Convention, for example, sets these minimum standards. It makes sure that copyright is granted automatically, so there are no legal formalities required to obtain copyright protection. You don't have to put a special symbol on your work. You do not have to register it anywhere. And the Berne Convention also carves out some specific limitations and exceptions to copyright, which we're going to talk about next. Just some specifics to Estonia and the EU, the European Union. One of the differences between US copyright law and copyright law in Estonia and the EU um, is that there are sort of some related rights to copyright. Copyright is generally, to create, to incentivize authors to create things. There are generally two sorts of incentives that are baked into copyright law or built into copyright law. One of those is economic. So authors have economic rights to their works. Only the author can sell their creation or authorize other people to sell their creation, right? But there's also a moral rights component. The US does not have a system of moral rights in the law, but the EU and Estonia does. And moral rights are things like the author has the right to be credited as the author of their work. They have the right to be associated with the work and to get credit for doing that work. They also have the right to have their name removed from derivatives of the work that they don't agree with. These moral rights are going to be important a little bit later on as we start talking about the licenses, but just know that they exist. They don't exist very much in my country, but they exist in most other countries. Similarly, we're going to talk, of course, about data and databases. In the US, databases do not generally have copyright protection. But in the EU, they absolutely do. Database creators generally do retain copyright in the databases they created. But it gets tricky. We're going to talk about that a little later this afternoon. Also, I mentioned things like copyright is automatic and you don't need to register to receive copyright protection in your work. In the US, actually, it's very helpful to register your work. We have a copyright office. And if you register, it helps you defend your copyright if you need to go to court. In most of the European Union countries, including Estonia, there is no need to register to get those stronger protections. Your courts just recognize that you have copyright in things without the extra paperwork. So that's copyright in a nutshell. Obviously, as with many legal topics, this is a very complex area. I am not a lawyer. I'm just a person who works with lawyers and knows a little bit about these things. So I cannot give legal advice, but I'm happy to share the information I know. And if there's any questions about how copyright works, especially as we start to apply it to CC licenses, do put those in the chat. But for now, I'd like to talk a little bit about exceptions and limitations to copyright. So copyright is automatic for every original work of creative expression. So this sounds kind of big and scary, right? Everything in the world is copyrighted. Oh my gosh, how does anyone actually get anything done? And it's because copyright does have some limits. It lasts for a long time, but not forever. So when copyright expires, after that life of the author plus 70 years, those materials then enter what we call the public domain. And the public domain is this big pool of creativity and public knowledge that exists beyond the limitations of copyright. So things generally enter the public domain because they're very old and their protection has expired. So that's the image that this image is based on is one such example of a very old piece of art that is now in the public domain. Sometimes work is in the public domain because it wasn't eligible for copyright in the first place. So facts and ideas are in the public domain. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Anybody can use that. It's in the public domain. You can't copyright the fact that 2 plus 2 equals 4, or the fact that my eyes are brown, for example. Um, Before we had international laws and treaties, there were some countries that required certain formalities to obtain copyright protection. So there's a handful of things that are in the public domain because they didn't meet those formalities back when those were required. It's a very small subset of things. In the US, that gets very complicated. In other countries, it's a little easier. Um, and of course, you can, as a creator, you can dedicate your work to the public domain. So you can waive your copyright by using a specific tool that CC has put out there called CC0 that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But a lot of cultural heritage institutions, museums, galleries, libraries, archives work with a lot of public domain materials, historical societies, for example. And those are beyond copyright protection. Copyright has expired. So there are things out there you can use without having to specifically ask for permission. Similarly, there are other exceptions and limitations. Um, so all countries that have signed international treaties like the Berne Convention allow the public some rights to use copyrighted works without permission, without having to track down the person and ask, and without violating their rights. So that we call these exceptions and limitations. In the US, we have a system called fair use. I'm not going to go into the details of fair use because you're not in the US. It's very complicated. It's a big gray area, and US law is not very specific about fair use and how it works. So I give a lot of trainings about fair use because there are a lot of questions. It's kind of a spectrum of possibilities from yes, this is probably fair use to no, this is probably not fair use, and then there's a ton of things in between. So some countries do their exceptions and limitations the way the US does by, saying, oh, well, you have to take into consideration these different factors to determine if your use is okay. Other countries, and Estonia is one of these, Japan is another one, actually list specific activities in their copyright law that are excluded from the reach of copyright. So in the Copyright Act that I linked, for example, you can read these exceptions in Chapter 4. Don't read it now. It's a lot of legal jargon. But for example, you have specific outlines or specific exceptions that are outlined in sections 18 to 25 of the Estonian Copyright Act that say things like personal use of a copyrighted work is okay. So if you're a researcher and you want to make a copy of an article for your own personal use to have in your notes that you can refer back to later, that's okay. You can freely use works for scientific, educational, informational, and judicial purposes. So an exception for education like this is very common in most countries. There are usually a couple of requirements. So your educational use must be non-commercial. You can't make money off of somebody else's work. Um, but yeah, you can use a lot of copyrighted works in the classroom. You can include summaries and quotations of things. You can use them to report on current events. So education is one of, and it's one of the biggest fair use uses in the U.S. also, is these sort of copyright exceptions for education. Some of the research that you all do may also fall under this exception for scientific and informational purposes. Um, there are some exceptions to copyright for public libraries, museums, and archives. Um, these exceptions generally allow libraries and archives to do things like lend copyrighted works out to the public, to make copies for preservation purposes, that sort of thing. Um, and there are some exceptions in Estonian copyright law about public art and architecture, which is essentially that if a work of art is out there in public, you can take pictures of it. A photograph is you know, taking a photograph of somebody else's work is kind of is making an adaptation of their work in some way. We're going to talk a little bit about what that means later on. Um, so under all rights reserved copyright, that might not be allowed, but there's an exception, again, as there often is in many countries, for works of public art and architecture. Um, just the nature of them being in public just makes it easier to just, you know, people are going to take pictures. Those things are going to show up in the background of people's tourist photos. So they're generally accepted. But the biggest takeaway here is that, especially for things like educational uses, there are some exceptions to copyright law that allow people to use things in certain limited circumstances. So I'm going to pause here in case there are questions about copyright. That was a very quick overview. But that's sort of the basics that you need to know to understand how the CC licenses work. And that's what we're going to start talking about next. Okay. Key takeaways for copyright. It's automatic. It applies to any original creative work that has been expressed in an objective form. So as soon as you've written it down, recorded it, uh, painted it on a wall, taken a photograph of it, now it has copyright. And again, it has copyright whether you want it or not. Copyright is automatic and it lasts for a long time, even after you have passed away. So now we're going to talk about the CC licenses. And we talked about sort of, there's kind of a spectrum here. So copyright is on one end. All rights reserved, only the creator can do things with their work. There are some exceptions, but they're very specific and they only apply in some very specific and narrow areas like education uses. But generally, copyright, all the rights are held by the author or the creator. And we mentioned the public domain, which is the other end of the spectrum. There's no copyright anymore. Anyone can do anything with a public domain work. Yeah. You don't have to ask for permission. You can make adaptations of public domain works. You can make derivative works. These are things like translating them into other languages or adapting, making a film version of a book. That would be an adaptation. Recording an audiobook version of a textbook is an adaptation. And again, copyright says that, you know, only a copyright owner has the right to make an adaptation or derivative work based on their work. And if anybody else wants to do it, they need to ask permission. Copyright owners, of course, can give permission to whoever they want. So a lot of authors, for example, will sign a contract with a publisher that says, yes, you can make an audiobook out of my book. But they have to have that contract in place. A publisher cannot just go and make an audiobook out of anything. They will probably get sued for copyright infringement if they do that. So we have no rights in the public domain, pretty much. All the rights in copyright. And a little over 20 years ago, some folks got together and created Creative Commons and created these licenses because they said, well, there's this whole spectrum in between, right? Some creators might want to allow people to do certain things with their work. They might want to preserve some of the rights that copyright gives them, but others they might be willing to give away to the public. So sometimes we call Creative Commons licenses some rights reserved. So as mentioned, copyright law started way back in the era of the printing press. And it hasn't been updated very frequently. For example, I mean, this also, again, about 20 years ago, when Creative Commons started, was about when the internet started becoming a bigger thing. And that created a real tension. Copyright law says, only a creator can make copies and share and distribute their work. But technologically, it's really easy for me to cut and paste somebody else's work on a computer. It's really easy for me to download and share a file. So copyright law says every time I download and share a file, I'm supposed to track down the author and ask their permission to do it. But most people don't do that. The internet makes it really easy to just not have to do that. So Creative Commons licenses were created to kind of help deal with that tension. We discovered that there are lots of authors who are completely happy to share their things online, to share their works, to further public knowledge and public culture. But there was no good way for them to do that. The only way to do that before CC licenses was to, sign a specific contract or a specific license with each and every person who wanted to use it. Or to just look the other way when people used it. So CC licenses were created to make it more clear to the general public what they can and cannot do with a copyrighted work. A couple of notes, CC licenses they don't replace copyright. So I talked earlier about how I have copyright in my PowerPoint slides, but you may notice I have this little CC symbol at the bottom of my slides. And in the notes of the slides, I have a full licensing statement. I have licensed these slides with a CC BY 4.0 international license. I still have the copyright in my work. I am still the creator. There are still exclusive rights that belong to me. But by putting a CC license on my work, I am telling the public, anyone who can see that license knows, oh, okay, I'm allowed to use this work under these conditions of this license. And I don't have to ask permission first. The author already gave me permission. That's what this license means. I have permission. It's right there. I don't have to go specifically ask them. They already put it on the work. You are allowed to do these things. But because CC licenses work on top of copyright, they work with copyright, the license permissions last for as long as copyright does. What this means is that when copyright expires and something enters the public domain, the CC license also expires. You cannot CC license something that is in the public domain. If there's no copyright, then there's nothing to license. So that's important to know, is that public domain works, stay in the public domain. If you find, CC licenses have only been around for about 20 years. So you're not going to find anything that's so old that copyright has expired that is also CC licensed. But someday you might, if you live long enough. At that point, if the copyright has expired, then the license restrictions are also expired. You do not have to follow them anymore. It's also important to know CC licenses are fully enforceable. These are legal tools. Just like you can enforce your any traditional copyright, you can go to court and enforce your CC license and make sure that people follow it. Exactly how you do that changes from country to country. You know, everybody has their own laws about exactly how you get compensation or kind of what you're supposed to do if you feel your rights are being infringed. But CC licenses are fully legal, fully enforceable. Um, Honestly, this is just a slide with a bunch of flags on it. This is not every single country where CC licenses work. This is just some of them. CC licenses were designed and vetted by legal experts from all over the world and aligned to international copyright laws. We were able to do this because of those international treaties, made things a lot easier to deal with. CC licenses have stood up in court. I did not specifically look to see if we know of any cases in Estonia. I kind of doubt there are any, to be honest. Um, but I just put a link in the chat if anyone's interested. We do have a legal database that has a list of all the times that Creative Commons licenses have been litigated, that they've gone to court. And every time they have gone to court, you know, judges have said, yes, these are valid legal tools and we should follow them and we should do what they say. So CC licenses work all over the world, which also makes things a lot easier in the age of the internet where you're using data from all over the world. You're sharing things globally and across country lines. There are only a handful of countries where they don't apply. And I don't even, it was like 3 or 4 on the list. I don't even have an updated list. But the only places where CC licenses don't work are places that don't have copyright law. Because CC licenses work with copyright. It's kind of an important thing. So there's just a small number of countries that don't have any copyright laws and also are not part of any of these international treaties that talk about copyright law. But generally, anywhere that you've ever been or heard of has copyright law, and therefore the CC licenses will work there also. Okay, some specifics now. We're going to start diving into exactly what the CC licenses are. So first, we'll talk a little bit about how they work. There are actually sort of 3 different ways that we communicate the license terms. We call it sort of a 3-layer design. So each of the licenses, and there is more than one, each of the Creative Commons licenses has these 3 different layers. And this is a really neat design that makes them work in lots of different contexts. So this layered design is part of what makes CC the global standard for copyright licensing. The first layer that you see at the top of this image is the legal code. So the actual legal terms that are enforceable in court. Excuse me, closing the door again for Kat. The actual legal terms. So this is the lawyer language. This is the stuff that actually holds up in court. So I'm just going to keep putting lots of links in the chat. Again, these are all in the notes of the slides, so you will have access to these links later. But in case you're interested in seeing what that legal code looks like, the legal codes have been translated into a number of different languages. In fact, I wonder if I can. I'm going to share this tab instead. Hopefully now you can all see the legal code. So as we get into the legal code, it starts to look a little bit like that Estonian copyright law page, right? We have sections, we have, you know, A's, B's, and C's, very specific legal terms. And at the very top of the page is where you can find some of the other languages that we have translated into. I don't know if Estonian is available yet, but if anyone is interested in translating, we do have some projects where we get volunteers from our community to help us do that. So the next layer is the human readable layer. So we'll look, for example, at the exact same license, but this time we'll look at sort of the plain language. Sometimes we call this the deed or the commons deed. It still has a link to the legal code in case anyone's interested, but this is much easier to read and follow. You can see the page is much shorter, for one, and we kind of try to put the things you need to know in these bullet points in plain language. Here's, if you're just a human out there who has come across a license and you want to know how it works, this is the part that will tell you. Lastly, and you should be seeing my slides again, the sort of third layer of design is the machine readable layer. And we have sort of consistent metadata and a consistent metadata schema that we've developed that recognizes, it allows software applications, search engines, APIs, other kinds of technology to be able to see and understand if a work is CC licensed. So for example, if you go to Google image search, there is, I'm going to see, we're going to do another live demonstration. Share this tab instead. Okay. So if I do a Google image search for puppies, there's this toolbar at the top that nobody ever looks at, but this is where you can do more advanced search techniques. And under tools, you can click on this tools, you will see a drop down for usage rights. And you can see that you can actually sort and filter your Google image search results based on only Creative Commons licensed things. This is made possible because of that machine readable layer of the licenses. It's that machine readable metadata that allows Google to be able to know if a work is CC licensed or not. Google image search does sometimes make mistakes. There's no person kind of vetting and double checking that this stuff really is CC licensed. But for the most part, this is a pretty good tool. We'll talk about some other tools to find CC licensed resources if you're interested. But yeah, a lot of these come from places like Wikimedia Commons, Flickr, DeviantArt. All of these places allow CC licensed works and allow people to mark them in a way that they're searchable. Also, thank you very much for noting in the chat that there is an Estonian translation in process, at least for the CC BY license, which is wonderful. If anyone's interested in getting more involved in that, feel free to contact me and I can put you in touch with the right people, or feel free to contact this person in the chat who might know and be involved. Okay, so those are the three layers of the CC licenses. This is what makes them work. We talked about how there's this spectrum of permissions, the public domain on the one side where there's no rights reserved, creative, or yeah, all rights reserved copyright on the other end of the spectrum. I do see a couple questions in the chat I'm going to get to in a second. There are actually 6 CC licenses and 2 legal tools. So one of the common misconceptions I hear is people were like, oh yeah, I've heard of CC licenses. And they think it's one license. They think of the CC license. There are actually 6 different CC licenses. We're going to talk about each one. And they're made up of these 4 elements. These 4 icons you see on the screen represent these 4 elements. So we combine these 4 license elements in different ways to make the 6 licenses. So you may have seen these icons online. If you haven't noticed them before, you will probably start seeing them everywhere. We know of, at the moment, over 2.5 billion works that have CC licenses, and those are just the ones that we can find. We don't track CC licenses in any way. You don't register anything when you apply a license. We'll talk about that too. So this is just through the searching we've done. We know there's at least 2.5 billion works out there and probably more. All of Wikipedia, for example, is CC licensed. If you scroll to the bottom of a Wikipedia page, you will see a note there that it's licensed CC by SA. TED Talks, for example, are CC licensed. A lot of the data in the Estonia Open Data Portal is CC licensed. We'll see that later on too. So real quick, what these icons and elements are. This first one on the left side of the screen with the little person inside of a circle. This is our by element, by, which means attribution. So any license that has this element requires attribution. What that means is you need to give credit to the original creator anytime you're using or adapting their work. We have specific recommendations on how you can do that. But essentially, attribution requires you to name the author. Give credit where credit is due. This is really important. In fact, it's so important that all of the 6 CC licenses have this condition in them. They all require attribution. The next element on your screen, this sort of circular arrow, is the share-alike element. We abbreviate it SA. When you see something with a share-alike license, it means that any derivative works you make, any adaptations of that work, must also be shared with an open license. So if Wikipedia articles, for example, are licensed CC by SA, share alike, because Wikipedia wants to make sure that their knowledge stays open. So if you are adapting an article from Wikipedia or making a derivative work based on an article from Wikipedia, you must also CC license your work and share it in the same way. This next symbol is a $ with a slash through it. We actually have this icon available on our website. We have all these icons available for people to download and use. And we have this one available in a number of different currencies. So there is one with a euro, which I should have put on here, but I reused an old slide, so apologies for that. So that $ with a slash through it means non-commercial. We'll abbreviate that NC. This means that I give you permission to use my work, but only for non-commercial purposes. I'm reserving the commercial rights for myself. So I don't want you to make money off of my work. I don't want you to put my art on a t-shirt and sell it for a profit unless you've asked me first and I gave you specific permission for that. But I'll grant everybody permission to use my artwork in some non-commercial way. You can use it for charity, you can use it in the classroom, you can, do something fun with it for your own personal use that doesn't make a profit. That's totally fine. And this last icon with the equal sign in the circle stands for no derivatives. We abbreviate it ND. This means you can absolutely share my work, but I don't want you to change it. No derivatives means no adaptations of the work. You can share that work, you can use that work, but you need to leave it whole and intact and unchanged. So if I write a book and I license it with an ND license, I'm totally happy for people to make copies of that work, even commercially, that's fine if it just says ND. But I don't want somebody to make a movie based on my book unless they've asked me first and I've given them permission. So this is important to know, is that even when you CC license something, you as the creator still have your rights. So if I license, I write a book and I license it with a non-commercial license, what I'm doing is communicating to everyone else in the world, you can use this work without hunting me down and asking me for permission, so long as you're doing it non-commercially. But I, as the copyright owner, as the creator of the work, I can still use my own work commercially. I have all my rights. I can make all the money I want. The CC license is not restricting me. It's communicating to the public, here's what you can and cannot do with my work, just by default, without having to ask. So a couple of things to note. all of the licenses include this buy condition, this attribution requirement, because we know it's really important for creators to get credit for their work. Beyond that commonality, the licenses vary based on whether commercial use is allowed or not, and whether the work can be adapted, and if so, on what terms. So here are the 6 different CC licenses, and the 2 public domain tools, which we'll also talk about. But let me go back to the chat for just a second. There was a clarification. I misspoke. The whole, like, all the licenses are being translated into Estonian, not just the CC BY license. That's typically how it works, and that's good. But there's also a really good question. So a lot of the open data in the Estonian Environment Agency, for example, is licensed CC BY. If the user does not refer to us as an author or does not name them as an author, what is the consequence? I'm going to find the link here. There's a really good, so Creative Commons has a really robust FAQ page, frequently asked questions. And there's a really nice answer to this. Let me find after licensing. Here we go. Oh, we've made a whole new page about it. So I'm going to just answer this question really quick. There's this really nice page on the CC website about what to do if you've CC licensed your work and you think somebody is misusing it. They're not following the license. So if you licensed something CC BY and somebody is using it without giving you credit, then they're not following the license. And so we kind of outlined some steps that we think it's useful for people to take. Most of the time when something like that happens, it's just an honest mistake. Most people, they don't understand attribution. They haven't taken one of my trainings, or they're just not sure how to do it, or they did it, but not very well. And so you can't find it. Like they put the attribution somewhere far away from the actual thing where no one will see it. Most of the time, if you reach out and you just say, hey, I'm the author of this work and you're supposed to name me, can you fix it? Most of the time they'll fix it. If that doesn't happen and you want to take further action, we kind of outline, again, this depends on your jurisdiction, sort of what legal actions you should take. In the US, there's kind of a process. You send them a letter and then a more formal letter. And then if they ignore all your letters, you can start taking them to court. And then you can sue for things. In Estonia, I'm not 100% sure what that process is. But most of the time, you can just kind of work it out. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit too about attribution and credit, especially for institutions as authors. So stay tuned later this afternoon. But first, I want to go through really quickly all these different licenses and exactly what they mean. And the 2 public domain tools. So I'll just note real quick, this very last public domain tool on the slide, it's a C with a slash through it. I'm actually not going to talk about that one very much. We call it the public domain mark, and it's the only tool that is not really a legal tool. It's just an informational one. The public domain mark you will most commonly see in like archive and museum collections. And it's just a way to say, we did the research and we're sure that this is in the public domain. It doesn't actually change the legal status of a work. The work is already in the public domain. This is just a way to say, hey, we know it's in the public domain. We want to let you know also. We're actually doing some work now to see if maybe there's a different way. Some people get the public domain mark and CC0, those two tools at the bottom. They look very similar and a lot of folks get them confused. So we're actually working on a way in the next few years to see if there's a way we can combine them or make that more clear. But since most of you are working with data that is not necessarily old enough to be in the public domain, although data might be in the public domain, we're going to talk about, you're not going to see this public domain mark very often. So I'm just going to mention it here and then I'm going to move on. So each of the licenses here are spelled out. You can also find this information on our website and in the notes in the slides. But the first license that was on the screen is the CC BY license. This is our most open of the licenses. This says people can use and adapt this work for any purpose, even commercially, just so long as they give credit to the creator. So long as you attribute me as the person who did the work, go for it. I'm okay with you doing whatever you want to do with it. And then they kind of get more conditions from here. So this is kind of the easiest one to understand. The next license is CC BY SA, or the Attribution Share Alike license. This allows people to use and adapt the work for any purpose, even commercially, so long as they give credit where credit is due. And if they make an adaptation of the work, they need to share that adaptation with other people under the same license. Some of you might be working a lot with software or coming from sort of the open source software world. And some of those open source licenses have been around even longer than Creative Commons licenses. So you might be familiar with what they sometimes call a copyleft license. And this is basically CC's version of a copyleft license. So a lot of software folks like this one because it's very similar to the software licensing tools that they're used to. In fact, one thing I will note, I have this note later on, but I also wanted to mention it up front. CC licenses work for anything, any copyrighted thing. But the one thing we don't recommend CC licenses for is software and code. And I know there is some software and some code, I think, in the Open Data portal, because I've seen some software licenses in the portal. CC licenses just, there's some special considerations when you're with software and copyright. There are some kind of special things. And CC licenses just weren't designed with software in mind. Partially because there were already some really good software licenses out there. So we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. Like there are some good tools already. But the software licenses don't really work very well for other types of copyrighted works. So the CC licenses is kind of for everything else. CC licenses are non-exclusive, meaning I can put a CC license on my work and I can still license some of my rights by a contract with somebody else, or I can put a CC non-commercial license on my work but still sell the commercial rights to somebody else through some other license or contract. That's totally fine. And a lot of times you will see with software in particular, you'll see the software is licensed under like a GNU public license or the MIT license, but the accompanying documentation, all the text and images and artwork might be CC licensed, and that's totally okay. These licenses are not exclusive and they often work together. So I will just make that note really quick for the software folks in the room. And note that we're going to talk about it in like an hour and a half. So CC BY SA. There's also CC BY NC, or attribution non-commercial. Says you can use the work, you can adapt the work, but only for non-commercial purposes. And of course, you have to give credit to the creator. Now we start to really combine some things. So the next license that's available is CC by NCSA, attribution, non-commercial, share alike. So if we go down the line, we know if we see something with this license, we need to give attribution to the creator, make sure they get credit. We know we can only do things for non-commercial purposes, so we can use and adapt the work, totally fine, but only for non-commercial things. And that if we do adapt the work, then we need to share our adaptations under the same or compatible license. So now we're starting to add more license restrictions, which is just more options for creators. One thing too that I will note about non-commercial licenses is that non-commercial is defined by the use and not the user. So a corporate for-profit company can use a non-commercially licensed work for non-commercial purposes. Maybe they're doing some sort of charity thing, or they're running a free program. That's okay. It's the actual use has to be non-commercial. But the actual user or entity or institution could be commercial or not. It's the use that matters. Similarly, a nonprofit educational institution can use non-commercial works, but only if they're doing non-commercial things. So, you know, a nonprofit university, for example, if they decide they want to take a non-commercially licensed artwork and put it on a t-shirt and try to sell it to make money for something, they cannot do that. Even though they're a nonprofit university, that particular use is designed to make a profit. It's designed for commercial purposes. And so that would be not okay. So that's another important thing to keep in mind. Non-commercial is about the use and not about who's using it necessarily. Our fifth license option is the attribution no derivatives license. So again, you can use the work. You have to give credit where credit is due, but also you cannot share any adaptations of the work. The latest versions of the licenses do technically allow people to make adaptations for their own personal use, mostly because copyright law generally allows people to do things for their own personal use. It's one of those exceptions we talked about. So we're not going to take away rights that somebody already has under the law. But you can't actually share or publish those adaptations, so it's not very useful. Well, actually, I could see it could be very useful. For example, translations are a big example of adaptations. So you're certainly allowed to translate things for your own personal use. You just can't share those translations publicly unless you have permission. So that's by ND. And then the last license is attribution, non-commercial, no derivatives. Again, if we think about combining these elements, you have to give credit to the creator. Only non-commercial purposes are allowed, and no adaptations. Keep the work whole and unchanged. So you can still use it, you can make copies, you can distribute it, you can share it with all your friends, you could perform it publicly. You just have to keep it whole. Don't make a bunch of big changes. Don't, you know, totally transform it into something new, but you can absolutely share it. Lastly, we have this legal tool. Some people call it a license. The lawyers tell me that technically it's not a license, it's a legal tool. I think that distinction only matters very much if you're a lawyer. But we do have a tool that allows people to dedicate their work to the public domain. We call it CC0, and it's this 0 in a circle. So we talked about the ways that work can enter the public domain. usually because it's very old and copyright has expired. But one of the options is that a creator can just dedicate their work to the public domain. And this is how they would do that. So somebody might say, I don't need any rights in this work. I don't even care if you give me credit. You know, like I don't need a CC BY license. I don't care about attribution. So I'm just going to put it in the public domain. People can just do whatever they want with this. It is important to note in some countries, and a lot of the EU countries are like this, and in my interpretation of the Estonian copyright law, I think this also applies in Estonia. Some countries have really strong moral rights, like we talked about. So they might not actually allow creators to waive all of their rights under copyright. Some countries don't allow people to ever give up those moral rights, for example. So technically in those cases, the CC0 works as sort of a fallback license that just allows anyone to do anything with the work unconditionally. Technically, it gets, again, this is technical stuff, like it's not technically in the public domain at that point, but essentially it is, and you've made it very clear to users that that's what you would like, that you would like it to be treated as if it's in the public domain. One important thing, okay, so CC0 means that no rights are reserved. Creators waive all their rights, place their work directly and immediately in the public domain. From a reuse perspective, there's kind of two notes I like to mention about CC0. Technically, there's no BY condition here. Attribution is not legally required for CC0. I always still recommend that people do it. It's generally considered a good practice. So many of you are working with data in research contexts. I have a background as an academic working at a university. In that context, you always give credit to the creator, right? If you don't cite your sources, then it's plagiarism, and that's bad. So there's sort of a societal norm. We kind of have this, it's considered very normal and very appropriate to give credit to anyone whose work you're using, even if it's in the public domain, even if it's really old. We don't want to try to steal other people's ideas, right? We don't want to try to take credit for work that's not ours. And so we'll talk a little bit about our data recommendations, get into this more specifically. And for those of you who are wondering, when are we going to talk about data? We are. So 4-hour training, we're going to get there. Another important thing to know is that CC licenses are specifically built on copyright. There are some other things that may apply. So even for a CC0 work in the public domain, there are other types of intellectual property. I did not look these up. I am not an expert on these other types of intellectual property, so I do not know how they work in Estonia. But the US has a very robust system of trademarks and patent rights. Trademarks is usually how a company protects its brand, and patents are used to protect inventions. Those are a whole different set of rights. Some things might be eligible for both copyright and patent rights, copyright and trademark rights. There are also some countries have very strong publicity rights or privacy rights. Certainly the EU has some privacy rights codified in the GDPR. And this public domain waiver doesn't apply to those either. All you're waiving here are your copyrights. So it is important to know if you're using a work that's in the public domain, just keep in the back of your mind, you know, to maybe double check, wait, are there any patent restrictions that I should be thinking about here? Or are there privacy concerns that I should be thinking about here? because those are still important to keep in mind. Even if it's not a legal concern, certainly an ethical concern is to make sure that we're respecting privacy rights, especially, and any other rights that folks might have in the work. Publicity rights are usually things like celebrities having the right to um, control how their appearance is used. So some countries have very strong rights around, you can't, if I'm a famous person, you can't take a picture of me and Photoshop it in a way that it looks like I'm endorsing your product, even though I've never endorsed your product. That would violate my publicity rights. I have the right to decide how my likeness is used um, in those sorts of instances. So CC licenses don't affect any of that, just copyright. But you will see a lot of data marked with CC0. Um, and you'll learn why in a little bit. So uh, this is just kind of a spectrum of all of the licenses from least restrictive to most restrictive. All of these are perfectly valid options. Um, it just depends on what your needs are. So which license somebody chooses depends on their particular needs. So the licenses shown at the top of the spectrum here are the most open or the least restrictive. So obviously things that are in the public domain, there's no rights anymore. That's the most open. You can share, you can remix, you can do commercial things, whatever, doesn't matter. Public domain dedication obviously is right up there. And then it goes down to sort of the most restrictive. Obviously a license with a lot of conditions like CC BY, NC, ND has the most restrictions on what people can and cannot do with that work. They can still share it, but they can't adapt it. They can still share it, but not commercially. They can share it, but they have to give credit. There are advantages and disadvantages to all of these licenses, depending on your vantage point. A few more things to note about the licenses before we do a little demonstration of kind of how this works, how to choose a license. CC licenses are enforceable in court. That enforcement generally, the responsibility for that is generally on the user. So not the host platform or repository. So if I, as a user, um, put something on YouTube and I don't pay attention to the license restrictions and I violate some of them, that's my fault. It's not YouTube's fault. Same with copyright. There are some local laws in some places that are kind of trying to change that. You might have heard of some cases, for example, of YouTube being sued for copyright infringement in some places. But generally, it's the way the internet has worked for a long time is that we kind of um, try to put the responsibility on people rather than just on the platforms. Because anybody can share anything on YouTube. That's kind of what it was built for. And it's up to people to make sure that they are doing things legally and responsibly when they're sharing. Only a copyright holder can CC license their work. Only I, as the creator of the thing, have rights to begin with. And so I'm the only person who can license those rights. You can't license somebody else's stuff. You can't take something out of the public domain and stick a license on it. It's not yours. So similarly, one of the things that commonly comes up is that if I'm creating an open textbook, for example, I'm an educator, so sorry, I fall back on a lot of education examples. I'm writing a textbook and I decide I want to use a chapter from somebody else's textbook and it's CC licensed. Great, I can do that. I stick that in my work. I want to use an image, it's CC licensed. Great, I do that. I make sure those things are attributed properly, that I've cited my sources. Uh, and then I apply a CC license to my work as a whole. Um, the CC license that I apply to my textbook only applies to the parts that I created. The original licenses still apply to those other things I found and reused. I'm not changing their license terms. So one example here, I haven't had one of my picture slides yet. Let me find. Nope, nope, nope. All right, I'm gonna end up. Okay, here's a good example. Um, so my PowerPoint presentation, my Google Slides, are licensed CC BY. But this image that I've used, this attribution might be too small for you to see on your screen, but I have the attribution here, what the image is, and it's licensed CC BY NC ND. This image license still stays the same. I can't use it commercially. I can't make adaptations of it. The rest of my presentation is still licensed CC BY, all the new things that I added. But this image is still CC BY NC ND. Yeah, my license cannot change somebody else's license. I'm not the copyright holder in that image. I can't go and do anything. I can't CC license it. I can't take away the CC license. One other thing to note is that CC licenses are non-revocable. What does that mean? It means that once you put a CC license on a thing, it's CC licensed. And we're going to look at a real example in a second. But you can't really take it away. You can kind of try. So say I put these slides on the internet, they're licensed CC BY, and 10 years from now, I'm like, I actually don't care about credit. I'm going to dedicate these slides to the public domain. Or maybe I go the other way, like, CC BY, I don't want people to use these slides commercially. I'd rather do CC BY NC. I can't retroactively go back and change the license on these slides. I can republish the slides with the new license. But as we know, once something's out on the internet, it's out there. Every embarrassing Facebook photo you've ever put on the internet is probably still there somewhere. So if somebody finds my original slides with the CC BY license, those are the conditions that they can follow. If I can somehow scrub all of those copies and the only one available is the CC BY NC, then okay, those are the license terms. That's all anybody can find. But if somebody still has that old copy with the old license, that's legal and that's okay. So it's important that you kind of think through your options before deciding your license. And somebody asked in the chat, is there a tool that can help you choose the right license? Someone put a link to the Clarin tool. Clarin is a whole different set of licenses that are not CC licenses and that I don't know anything about other than that they exist. And they don't seem to be quite as robust. But there is a tool that I'm going to show you. That was my next thing. So there's a bunch of resources on here, and one of them is the Creative Commons License Chooser, which I'm also going to show you. So we have this tool on our website. I recommend bookmarking it. I find it very helpful. And anytime you want to mark your work with a CC license, you can use this tool. This is not a registration form. We don't store any information. We don't keep track. We care about data privacy. We're not interested in like collecting a lot of info on people. But we want to make sure people have the tools they need. So maybe you already know a lot about licensing and you know exactly which license you need. So you can just say, yes, I know what license I need. I want CC BY SA. Boom, here it is. But maybe you don't know, which is fine. So no, I need help selecting a license. This will walk you through step by step all of the things you need to think about when you're choosing a license. I love this tool. So the first thing to think about is, do you want credit for your work? And if you don't care about credit, you can hit no and it'll say, okay, well, the public domain dedication, that's what it's for. Anyone can do anything, whatever. But yes, I do care. I want people to, and it's still recommending me. Let me refresh the page. It's using my old data. Okay. So yes, anyone can use my work. Or no, sorry, anyone using my work must include proper attribution. So yeah, if I want attribution for my work, CC BY is a start. It's one of, but there's some other things we should think about. So do I want to allow other people to use my work commercially? And maybe I say, no, I only want non-commercial purposes. I'm interested in furthering research and education, but I don't need people to make a profit off of my work. Okay, there's some other things to think about. Do I want to allow other people to remix, adapt, or build upon my work? And if I say no, it's good to recommend something with an ND restriction. But maybe I say, yeah, I'm okay. I'm okay with remixing and adapting and building upon my work. I want people to translate it into other languages. I want people to do creative and fun things with it if it's useful for them. I wrote a book. I want people to make an audio version of it or make a movie out of it. Sure. If you do allow adaptations, then you're going to get this other question. If people do adapt your work and share it, do you want them to also CC license their work? And if you say yes, then you get the share alike condition, right? It's really important to me that things stay open. But maybe I don't care. I want as few restrictions as possible. I don't need. Um, so I've answered all my questions here. There's a little confirmation that just kind of gives you a double check. Make sure like you are the owner of the work. You're not trying to CC license somebody else's stuff. You kind of understand what the license does. We tell you, here's the terms. You understand that once you CC license something and put it out there, it's out there. So you check all of those, and then you get a license. You also get the chance to put in some more details about your work. This is very, very helpful. It allows people to build proper attributions, which we're going to talk a little bit about after we take a break. We're going to take a break soon, I promise. But let's say I took a picture of puppies created by me. I would put a link to the work because it's always helpful, especially if you're working with a public data set, for example, link to it. Let other people see where they can see and use that data. I could link to my own website if I want people to know more about me as a creator. I could put the year that I created it, just so everybody knows, hey, this is a really current resource. I just took this picture this year. Maybe I'm licensing some really old stuff that I did, I don't know, back in the 90s. Sure. And now I get my licensing statement. We learned a lot about how copyright works and a lot about CC licenses. And one of the questions I get that I didn't talk about yet is, well, like, how do you CC license a work, right? Do I have to register it somewhere? No. The way you CC license a work is just by communicating that you have CC licensed the work. You have to mark it somehow. And so that's what this tool helps you not only choose a license, but gives you the language you can use to mark that work. So there's this, the rich text includes sort of hyperlinks and these images. You can also have it spell out the full license name in words instead of the abbreviations. Whichever you prefer, they are both fully legal and enforceable as just a personal choice. If you are CC licensing something online, like a website, we give you HTML code that you can use. The really nice thing about this HTML code is that it includes all of the associated metadata to make that machine readable layer work. So that's really important. So we often recommend that people cut and paste HTML directly from this tool. We also provide some additional metadata in XMP format for folks who are working in um, certain systems where that type of metadata is helpful. This is sort of how to do it on the web. We also have kind of a plain text version. So this is the rich text. It includes hyperlinks and things. We have a plain text version if you are physically printing a book or a work and you want to CC license it. Obviously, you can't have a clickable link. So we have a version that spells the link out in text so that people can still find it. So there's also this plain text version, which again gives you the option of spelling the license out in full words or just the abbreviation. I have been working in some capacity for Creative Commons for 6 years now, and I still use this tool all the time. I mean, usually I know which license I want, but it's just super easy to just fill out the form and then cut and paste my license statement and just put it on my work. Yeah, it is. I mean, I think if there's one thing you remember from today, I would love for it to be the license chooser, if nothing else. Some other useful resources on here. Let me go back to sharing the slides. We do have a Creative Commons certificate course. This is an online course that we run. If you're interested in learning even more details about the Creative Commons licenses and how they work, we get into some really advanced scenarios in that course. Basically, what you've learned today is kind of the first 3 weeks or so of the 10-week course, and then we kind of go dive even deeper. But also all of those course materials are openly licensed and available for free online. So that's a helpful link to have if you're looking for information after today. That can be a good place to find it. So our frequently asked questions page is also very helpful. And one other resource that I'm not sure I have linked on here. We just talked about using the license chooser and marking your work with a CC license. If anyone else needs more concrete examples, we do have this wiki page on the CC wiki that actually gives you very concrete examples of how to mark your work with a CC license. So if it's a website, you know, here's an example of a CC license notice at the bottom of a website. You can put it on a blog. You can put it with an image. In a PowerPoint presentation, for example, a lot of people ask, does it matter where I put the CC license? The answer is not really. It should just clearly be there for people to see. So it can be in the notes part of your presentation. It can be its own slide. It can just be the bottom of a slide or all the slides. Any of those work so long as you're clearly communicating. You can put it in more than one place if you want to make sure. So when I upload videos to YouTube, for example, which I frequently do as part of my job, I will include an actual frame in the video itself that says this is CC licensed, but I will also put something in the notes on YouTube in the video that says this is CC licensed and which license it is. I like to put it in both places just for people to be able to see both. Here's a snippet of some metadata from a data portal. It's the India Biodiversity Data Portal. We're going to take a look later on today about how licenses are marked in the Estonian Open Data Portal. But that's also a really helpful resource. One thing to keep in mind is that attribution is really important for CC licenses. And what we're going to do next, I think, yeah, I'm looking at the time. We're going to take a break. But when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about attribution and how it works, which is going to set us up for how we can use open data and how we can do it legally and responsibly. Um, One of the nice things about attribution is that, let me go back to the license chooser for a second. Um, if you have filled out all of the things in the license chooser and you have all of this info in here so that your license statement is really full and robust, now anyone using your work has all the information they need to give you a really good attribution. They have your name, they have a link to the work, they have exactly which license it is, and a link to the license terms. So if somebody's like, I don't know what CC by SA means, they can just click on it. These are all things we recommend when attributing the work. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. So what I would like to do now, let me make sure my timing. Yes. This is just a generic image to tell you that we're going to take a break. So this is a long afternoon we have together, and I recognize it's a long time to sit at your desk and listen to me talk. So I'd actually like to take about 15 minutes, a pretty long break, just to give everyone a chance to get up, stretch, get a beverage, get a snack, use the washroom, take care of anything you need to take care of, check that email quick. But we're going to reconvene at 10 after. So for you all, this should be 3:10, I believe.
Yes, it should be.
10 after the top of the hour. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to mute. I'm going to turn my camera off. We're going to come back at 10 after the top of the hour. So 3:10 p.m., 15:10, if you use 24-hour time. During the break, if you have any questions about copyright, CC licenses, all the stuff that we've talked about so far, please put those in the chat. And we will start with a little bit of Q&A when we return. And then we're going to start talking specifically about data and the data portal, which I know you've all been very patiently waiting for. So I will see you all in 15 minutes. Thanks. Hello, everybody. It's 15:10 by my clock, but I'm going to give it another minute or two for folks to come back and get settled. Hopefully you were able to do some things. I didn't even look at my email. I'm a little scared of what my email has done in the last few hours. I'll look at it later. Okay, I got one thumbs up in the chat. I know one person is back. Hopefully everyone is here. Yeah, I got more thumbs ups. Hooray! Okay. When you present online, it's just me talking in a random room to a sea of faceless people, which you get used to after a while. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I believe we are still recording. Yes, so that's good. Okay. First, I want to see, are there any questions about anything that we talked about in sort of the first half? We talked a lot about technical copyright stuff. I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but I'm also going to leave an awkward silence here. If anyone wants to unmute and ask a question live, do feel free to do so. Okay, I'm gonna keep moving right along. We'll see, the second half might be a little bit shorter. We'll see. Some of it depends on how many questions you all have. Okay, so you should still be able to see my screen. Right now it should be this picture of some sort of canal in Guatemala. And now it's some words about data. Okay. So let's start talking specifically about data. So we talked about copyright and how it works, and how it works globally. One thing about international copyright is that generally it's if you're using international material, generally it's the country where the use takes place are the laws that kind of apply if there's any sort of conflict. So, if you're physically in Estonia working with copyrighted resources, it is generally your copyright laws that matter the most, which is another one of these consequences of these international treaties. And we talked about the CC licenses and how they work. We mentioned attribution, but I'm going to put that on hold for a second to go back to talking about data, which involves talking about copyright again. So we learned things like copyright is automatic. Copyright only applies to original creative works. So you can't make a copy of somebody else's thing and claim a new copyright in it, right? That's not your original work if you're just stealing it from someone else. And we talked about how copyright does not apply to things like facts and ideas. And this is where data can be tricky. So what do we talk about when we're talking about data? We often use the word data to talk about a lot of different types of things. as far as copyright law is concerned. Data at its core, like a single data point, a lot of times what you're doing when you're recording data is measuring facts. So a lot of scientific data, for example, where you're measuring empirical things, you're measuring the height and weight of an object, or you're using GPS coordinates, latitude and longitude, sort of mathematical points or equations. A lot of those individual bits of data are just facts, kind of like 2 + 2 = 4. And so they might not have copyright protection. A lot of data doesn't meet the originality requirement. Me just measuring something or recording facts about an object is not really original work. It's just writing down some facts about the world. However, some data is a little more involved than that. So I have a background, for example, in linguistics. A lot of the linguistics data that I used to use involves actual speech. So either audio recordings or transcriptions of things like oral histories. Listening to somebody tell their own story in their own language, in their own words. Now that sort of thing is original enough to probably have a copyright. So you're all probably working with different types of data. So the copyright status may not always be clear. Additionally, data sets often include other things besides just the data. So sometimes there's commentary about the data. There's other ancillary or accompanying materials. So there might be software code along with your data. There might be some sort of documentation, explanations of what the different fields in the data set are, analysis of the data. And a lot of times those sorts of things are expressed in original language, in your own words, in an original way that would be eligible for copyright. Also, even though data at its core might just be a bunch of facts, the way you compile and arrange the data into a database, databases often have copyright protections, even if the data in them is just a fact that might be considered to be public domain. This is again where there's a difference. In the US, databases generally do not have copyright protection, or if they do, it's very weak. But in the EU, very specifically, there are laws that were passed that do give more protections for databases and database creators. What's the difference between data and a database is not super clear in the law. So when does a pile of data actually become a database? The answer is when the way that you've arranged and compiled the data is original enough. And who decides whether it's original enough? It's a gray area. It's generally safest to assume that databases and data sets that you're working with should be probably treated as if they're under copyright for most things. There's lots of public data sets that are open and available on the web. Even if they're not CC licensed, most of the ways that you're going to use those data sets are for educational purposes, for scientific purposes, for informational purposes. They fall under those copyright exceptions. So legally, you're probably still allowed to do all the things that you generally do with data. But we often recommend that people who are publishing data and data sets online CC license those data sets and databases, just to make it super clear that if there's a copyright claim here, I want to make it really clear what you can and cannot do with my data, what I prefer. Now, again, if I'm using this data under a copyright exception, like educational use, where copyright no longer applies, if there's no copyright, there's no CC license. But it's still helpful to communicate these social norms. And most people will respect that, like, okay, if I see that this data is licensed CC BY, it's really important that this person wants attribution. I will make sure I give them attribution. There are some helpful links in here that I'm just going to drop in the chat, but you will also have access to them later. These are all sections of our CC FAQ page. So there are some very helpful explainers about CC licenses and data and CC licenses and databases. And the big takeaways are basically that, we realize that data has a lot of potential for reuse. I mean, that's sharing data is kind of how it is useful. And most of those uses are scholarly or scientific. So most of those uses are allowed under copyright anyway. But a CC license can help make it really, really clear what you do and don't want done with your data. Some other things to keep in mind, specifically when you're using and reusing data, is we talked a little bit about how CC licenses only work with copyright, but there is stuff that's not copyright. And data in particular might be subject to some other types of intellectual property, like patents or trademarks. So generally, if you work in a space where patents are a thing, for example, but if you're looking at specific proprietary data about a new invention, for example, there might be some patent restrictions that you need to also pay attention to and follow. There are also ethical considerations around data. So this is not really a CC thing, but we use it and we like to make people aware of it. There's this organization that created these FAIR principles for scientific data management and stewardship. These are guidelines. They're not, this isn't like a legal requirement, but they're just general guidelines that asks people who are sharing data to try to make sure that that data is findable, that it's accessible, that it's interoperable so that it can be used across different file formats and different softwares, and that it's reusable. So, your data and its associated metadata should be well described. It should be easy to find. It should be easy to understand. The whole point of sharing data is to get people to use it. And so we want to make sure that we're making that as easy as possible for reusers. So our folks in the Open Climate Campaign, who I briefly mentioned earlier, have been doing a lot of work specifically about climate data. But I actually think that the things they are publishing about climate data are useful and apply to all data. So that's why I'm going to talk about it here. We'll put the link in the chat to their recommended best practices for better sharing of climate data. Again, I think this will be better sharing of any data. And these are their recommendations that you see on your screen now. Option A is by far the preferred option. So we often recommend, and we have long recommended this, we just now put it like in a document, and we got a whole bunch of worldwide international climate organizations to sign off and agree on this document. So now it's a really strong recommendation that data should be shared ideally under CC0. And then you can also request attribution, and probably should. I mean, one of the things about attribution is that, as we talked about, most of the people working with data are working in fields where, you cite your sources. That's the norm. So there's a slight difference between citation and attribution. I mean, citation is like a social requirement. It's a thing you do because it's expected or it's required of your job. It's a norm in your field in scientific research. Whereas attribution is an actual legal requirement. If you don't cite something, somebody might yell at you for plagiarizing and your work might be discredited, but you're not necessarily in any legal trouble. If you don't comply with an attribution request from a CC license, um, there are actually some legal actions people could take. The consequences aren't they're not very harsh, but essentially that person could just say, you're not following the CC license, so you can't use it. So we found that even with stuff that was in the public domain, even with stuff that was CC0 and dedicated to the public domain, that most people were providing attribution anyway. So we said, okay, I mean, why don't we just give you some language to just make that really clear? So you could put your licensing statement, could say, this work, and ideally it would say, title of data set by me working at employer is dedicated to the public domain as indicated by the CC0. Attribution is requested. Again, we know it's not necessarily required with CC0, although again, technically, like in Estonia, you have really strong moral rights. You should be attributing. Your copyright law kind of requires it. I don't think that's very strictly enforced, but it's, you should be doing it. But this just makes it even clearer, right? Like, hey, my organization published this data. We'd like to be associated with it. We want credit. So even though it may not be as strong as a legal requirement, it's just sort of a norm. And most of you are already doing this probably because this is already a widespread practice, like I said, through citation. And the other, so, we talked a little bit about the definition difference between citation and attribution. The other difference is that a citation includes pretty much all the information you need for an attribution. It just doesn't, like in most standard citation formats. So I don't know what you're used to, but there's a lot of different citation formats. There's an IEEE standard, there's MLA and APA in Chicago and a ton of others. For those of you who do academic research, you're very familiar with these references pages and these long works cited pages that are in a very specific format. And most of the citation formats don't have a specific place for you to put down the copyright status of the work. That's the major difference. So a citation includes a title, it includes the author, oftentimes it includes, if it's an online resource, it'll have a link to the source. All of these things also make for good attributions. Say who the author is. If the work has a title, say what it is, say where you got it from. But attribution also requires that you say which license it's under. So most of the times you can just take your academic citations and then just add a bit on the end that says, oh, also this work is licensed CC by 4.0, and boom, now you have an attribution. So it's not super difficult. It's not, it can very easily become a part of your workflow. Our second option for those who are unable to dedicate their work to the public domain through CC0 is to use a CC BY license. Now, attribution is a slightly stronger requirement. It's actually in the legal code of the license. So like, we really, really mean it. But it still allows for unrestricted reuse. People can still use your data and adapt your data, share your data. And that's really helpful and important. So really, actually, let me go back for a second. Really, these two options are very similar. The only difference is this like slightly stronger attribution requirement. but for most practical purposes, the results are the same. The one reason we prefer CC0 is because the copyright status of data is weird. A lot of data is already in the public domain because it's facts. And in some jurisdictions, even databases are just in the public domain. They're not considered original enough to have protections. So even if you license, remember your license only applies where copyright applies. So even if you take your data and you license it CC BY, if that data is just a list of facts and it doesn't have copyright in the first place, you can mark it with a CC BY license, but it doesn't really apply. People don't have to listen to it. It would be like taking a public domain work, like me taking the Mona Lisa and putting a CC BY license on it. So we think CC0 is just a little more clear. But CC BY is also okay because there are some elements that might be eligible for copyright. And so a CC BY license could apply to those elements and also just make it really clear to the reuser that like, hey, you can use this data, just make sure you give me credit. In the full recommendations, you can see we actually have a lot of examples of associated metadata to make it really clear when you're sharing data sets, kind of what these attribution or what these licensing statements look like, and kind of how to mark them. I'm not going to get into this too much, but if any of you work with metadata a lot, you can see the recommendations. And we're actually working with some of the international metadata standards providers to try to make sure these are like more standard parts. Make sure that they have actual fields in their metadata schemas to account for these sorts of things. So like I said, that full document goes into more details if anyone's interested. So I want to show you an example of what this looks like. I did not want it to open over there. Hold on. Give me a second to rearrange my screens in the way that works for me. Okay. Let me share the right tab. So I'm assuming that most of you are familiar with the Estonian Open Data Portal, but some of you might not be. Some of you might not really have used this. I am not an expert in the Open Data Portal. So really specific questions about how it works and how it was set up, I would look on the website, and Sophia might be a good contact for that. There's also contact information on the website. But I looked around this open data portal a little bit, and because I think it is what a lot of you folks are using, wanted to show you some of the things that I found. This is actually a really nice data portal. Has almost 2,000 data sets from a wide variety of different publishers. It's a lot of government data right now. So you can view all the different data sets, and when you click on some of these, so here's an example. Of course, I'm looking at this database in English because I am me. Obviously, the database is also fully available in Estonian. But here's an execution of the action plan for the government of Estonia 2023 to 2027. And you click on the data set and it gives you the title of the data set. It gives you author information. So it gives you a contact email, which is also helpful. A lot of times this author might be a person's name. Sometimes it's a organization or a department. This link here is the actual organization that was responsible for this data, which is also really helpful. We're going to see some examples. Description of the data set, some keywords, but the license information is right here in the metadata. So we can see this particular data set is licensed CC BY, Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International. Awesome. So we could download this data set. We could take a look at it. You're not going to be able to see where I opened the Excel on my screen, I'm realizing, because of the way that I shared. One thing to note, so we talked about marking your work with a CC license and where to mark your work. Some of the data sets you will see, like there's actually a page or a tab in the Excel spreadsheet that gives you the licensing info. Some of them do not have that. If it were me, I would recommend that if there's a place in the actual file where you can make a note that this is CC licensed, I would put it in the actual file and also put it in this metadata here on the Open Data Portal. Having it here is really helpful, definitely necessary. I just think I like to cover all my bases and maybe over communicate too much. Because I'm just, this is just an Excel file. It's possible that somebody could get a copy of this Excel file from somewhere else or from a friend. And if the CC license isn't in the file itself, they're not going to know how to use it or where it came from necessarily. So I often recommend that people put the CC license in as many places as possible. But yeah, so there's one data set. We can look at another, some plans for a city. This has a human named author, which is great, and the organization that they are with. And here we can again see a CC BY 4.0 license. Let me see. I don't remember which one I saw. That one doesn't have any license information. I had some great examples when I was going through earlier this week. Now I can't remember what I clicked on. Apologies. Other things, oh yeah, other things I wanted to point out that you'll see. Here's another CC BY 4.0. Yes, I wanted to point out this metadata because it is useful. In fact, the one thing that I like about this data portal that I don't see in every data portal is that not only do you have contact information for the owner or creator of the data set, which can be very helpful, not only if you have questions about the data set, but maybe you also do research in this area and you'd like to collaborate. Like, hey, I have some more data that you can include, or I'd like to help you collect your data. Now you have a way to contact them. I really like that it has this update frequency, the time coverage, but also, when was this added? When was it last modified? And we know it's typically updated once a year. So that's very helpful. And then the data set will either be downloadable at the bottom of the page, or it'll have a link to go to the data set where it's publicly available on the web. Okay. I promise there are things in here that are licensed with other licenses besides CC BY 4.0. This is an older version of a CC BY license, but still CC BY. I saw some CC0 stuff in here yesterday, but I can't find it now. That's not super important. Wanted to show you how that portal works. Okay. Just really quickly, because we have some time. I know this is a data training. Most of you are working with data, but just in case it's useful and you're brand new to CC licenses, there are other places you can find CC licensed works so that you can use them in your research. Many of these things you will probably know already, but just in case. Let me get you some links to put in the chat. For example, there's this very useful tool called the Directory of Open Access Journals. So maybe you've done some really cool things with your data and you'd like to publish an article about it. Maybe you want to make sure that article is available open access with a CC license. so that everybody else can also read it freely. So that's one resource, and it's also a place if you're looking for open access research. That's one place to look. As I mentioned earlier, Wikipedia, of course, is CC licensed. Wikimedia Commons is a really useful place to find CC licensed images. Another really useful place to find CC licensed images, we talked a little bit about Google image search, but I actually prefer using Openverse, which I will show you, and I put a link in the chat. This used to be called CC Search, so I don't know if any of you have been around long enough to remember CC Search. WordPress took over CC Search for us. We didn't have the tech infrastructure to support it anymore. So they very graciously took it on and turned it into Openverse. And this is a search engine that only searches content that is under a CC license or is in the public domain. So again, here, I've been searching a lot for puppies. Let's search for kittens. Right now, it only searches images and audio. Openverse used to also search for video resources. I'm hoping they bring that back someday. But I use this especially for images. So you can, and this is, I mentioned in Google image search that sometimes Google image search gets it wrong. It's, it might read the metadata incorrectly, or somebody input the metadata incorrectly. It's not vetted by a human. Openverse search results are much more reliable. These generally are vetted by humans, and you can rest assured that when you actually click on something and then you go to the source to download it and you actually find it where it is, that it really is CC licensed, even just like it said it was. So for example, I did that kind of fast. I found this image of a kitten. I can download this image from Flickr, so I click on that link, and now I'm over here on Flickr, where I can clearly see, this image of this kitten is by this guy, Michael Richardson, and it is CC BY licensed. It just has the little BY icon, and this link will take me to the version of the CC BY license that person is using. Well, let me start my sharing again. Sorry about that. Okay. The other really nice thing about Openverse is it gives you what looks a lot like the licensing statement from our CC license chooser, but which is actually an attribution. So this is what we're going to talk about next. This has all the information you need for a really good attribution, and it has it in rich text if you're using it on a website, it has an HTML version, has plain text if you are putting it on something in print. So that's what I want to, so finding and using, there's some more things on this slide if you're interested in finding and using CC licensed resources. Feel free to look at the notes then when you get the slides. But what I want to move into is attribution, because we talked about it a bunch. And then I said we're going to talk about it later, and later is now. So, as usual, I have another good resource for you. Here's another link in the chat. Don't worry, these links, they're in the slides. We have, again, it's another wiki page that gives recommended practices for attribution, but it boils down to what you see on your screen here. These are the things that we think make a really good attribution. And a complete and good attribution statement should include all four of these things, which we often call tassel. So TASL, tassel. An ideal attribution would include a title of the thing. Sometimes there isn't a title. I mean, if you can't find all this information, then okay, just include what you have. It'll include an author, which could be a person or could be an institution, or it could be both. So some of those data sets we saw in the open data portal, for example, and we're going to look at some more examples in a second. A human authored them, but they did that work as part of an organization that published it. And so it can be useful to also give credit to the publisher. So one example too is if you look, when you get my slides and you see my notes, you'll see my full attribution statement for my PowerPoint slides, where it says these slides were created by Shanna Hollich um, for Creative Commons. So I've included both. It can be helpful to include both. Including a source link is really important, especially because the whole point of openly sharing data and other resources is so that people can use them and reuse them. So you want to make it easy for someone to find the thing so they can use it and reuse it. And along those same lines, you want to include the license information or the legal terms. Sometimes you'll see attributions that say things like, um, this image by Shayna, taken from here, is all rights reserved copyright and used here under fair use, or used here under an education exception. So you can do this even for copyrighted things to make it really clear to a downstream user what they can and can't do with the stuff in your work. But most of the time you'll see the kinds of licensing statements that you're seeing on the wiki, which I will now move to sharing. So we recently updated this page. It's now very long. It explains sort of the basic components of a good tassel attribution. We ask you to be reasonable. So, one of the things is I get asked a lot is, well, does it matter exactly how I phrase my attribution? No. Does it matter exactly where I put my attribution? The answer is no. But it should be as clear as you can make it. And any reasonable person should be able to understand what it is. So again, in PowerPoint slides, when I'm attributing an image, you'll see in my slides, there was an attribution statement at the very bottom of the actual slide itself, right next to the image. I also typically will put that attribution in the notes in the slides, just to make it even easier for people to find. Sometimes you'll see people list all their attributions at the end, in like a works cited style list or a references list. That is also okay. I think it's a little harder that if you have like a long list of images in a work and you just have a big list at the end with all the attributions, I think it can be hard for someone to match up which attribution goes to which image. So I personally like to see the attribution like right there, right next to the image. So it's all together and it's very clear this goes with this thing. But it's not wrong to do it in a big list at the end. You have options. So here are some examples of some attributions. So here's a photo of some Creative Commons cupcakes. And here's a really good attribution for this photo. We know it's good because we can go through Tassel and see that all the elements are there. There's a title for this image. We have an author. We even linked to the author's profile page because this was a Flickr photo, so it was easy to do that. You don't have to, but it can be helpful. So why not do it if you can? We have a source for the image. So this is actually a link that takes you to the original Flickr page where we downloaded the photo and where you can also download the photo. And we have the license here, which is also linked to the actual license deed on our website. Again, we really recommend that folks do this because somebody might, they might see CC by 4.0 and they go, I don't know what that means. If you have the link there, now they know, oh, okay, I can just click and I can very clearly and easily read, oh, okay, CC by 4.0 means I can share and adapt so long as I give appropriate credit and there are no additional restrictions. Cool. Here's another attribution of the same image. If we go through Tassel, we don't have a title. That's kind of a bummer. Sometimes photos don't have a title, but like this one clearly does. So it'd be really nice if we gave it a title. If it didn't have a title, you could just say photo or just say this image. We have an author. Bonus points if we would have linked to his profile, but whatever. It's there at least. We've credited him. We do have a link to the original source, and we have a link to the license deed. Um, we didn't talk about versions of the licenses, but there have been different versions over the years that we basically have made some minor tweaks to the legal code to make the licenses more useful, more global, and more enforceable in court. Um, all the old licenses still work, and they work the same way. A CC by 2.0 license has the same, you need to attribute the creator. It's the same conditions as the CC by 4.0 license. We just recommend people use the most current version because it's just worded better and it just works a little bit better. But it can be useful for people to know, if this is actually licensed under CC by 2.0, maybe we should put that in there, right? Like we should put as much information as we have. So this is an okay attribution. There's room for improvement. Um, but the source and the license and the author, like this meets the legal requirements. We've credited the author. Here's a type of attribution you see very commonly, which is not good. This is not a good attribution. You'll just see photo, Creative Commons. What I see a lot, all the time, is photo, Wikipedia. Data set, Wikipedia. And this is a terrible attribution. I mean, aside from the fact that there's no title, the author is not noted here. I mean, Creative Commons is not the author of this photo. Timothy Vollmer is. He just CC licensed it. It's a common mistake to think that anything that's CC licensed is like owned by CC. That's not how it works, right? We just learned all this stuff about copyright and licensing. It's owned by the author. So CC is not the author here. And similarly, Wikipedia is not, articles that are written on Wikipedia are written by other people who are typically volunteers. And often their names are included and they should get credit for their work. Wikipedia didn't write the article. This person did and put it on Wikipedia. And of course, the two biggest problems with this attribution. Well, the biggest problem, of course, is that it's not an attribution, right? We didn't credit the author, so that we didn't give credit where credit is due. And the other big problems, of course, is that there's no link to the original source. So who knows where this photo came from? If I want to reuse it, I'll never find it. If I just want to verify that it really is CC licensed and that this person didn't make a mistake, there's no way for me to verify. And there's no mention of the license at all. Creative Commons is the name of an organization. There are 6 different licenses and 1 legal tool, CC0. You can't just say something is CC licensed. You have to say which license it is. That's important because, as we learned, all the different licenses have different restrictions. So it's really important to know which one you're using. And then there's some extra information on here. If you do make adaptations or derivatives, you can add a little bit of information to your attribution just to make it really clear that like, oh, I cropped this image a little bit just so a reuser knows, oh, okay, when I go look at the original, it's going to look a little different. And here's why. I'm not trying to pretend that they're exactly the same. I'm not hiding any of the work that I did. And then there's some other things about, how do you do attributions when you don't have text, right? If you're in an audio or a video recording. And again, similarly with a licensing statement, you could say it on the recording or I like to do both, put it in the notes in a description box on the actual website where you download the thing. And so this is where, I mentioned that attribution statement on Openverse looked a lot like our licensing statement on the license chooser. And that's because a good licensing statement can almost be cut and pasted as an attribution. And this is why we teach, we made the license chooser so that it gives really good and fully formed licensing statements, because it makes it easier for a reuser to properly attribute you. And we know attribution is important, so we want to make it as easy as possible for people to do that. Um, let me see. Let me check my timing and see where I am. Yeah. So one thing we see very commonly, and that you will see as you start noticing these things online, is there's a lot of CC licensed work out there that just has the license icon on it, and that's it. And that's legal. Like that's fine. If you put the CC license icon on your work, that work is CC licensed. Um, but we recommend that somewhere also people put that full complete licensing statement that has the title of the thing, your name, and exactly how you want to be credited, the actual license or legal terms with the link to where we can get more information about the license or legal terms. Because it just makes it more likely that people are going to A, use your work, and B, use your work in the way that you want them to. So we want to set people up for success. And I think it's, one thing the open data portal does nicely by having all that metadata there is that you can easily find the title, the author, all the links you need. The license terms are right there. So what I'd like to do now, and I know we're not like super interactive, but I am hoping that you guys will open your chat window, because I'm going to do just a little bit of like Q&A here. I want to show you some actual attributions, and I want you to tell me in the chat if they're good or not. Like, are they as complete and full as they could be? Do they follow tassel, or are there some things missing? So these are actual examples that I pulled earlier this week from the data portal. So let me, if you would like to see these in the actual portal, I can give you links. So here's the first one that I found in the data portal. Let me also follow this own link and make sure it does what I want it to do. Yes, it does. So in the chat space, you can see, I took a screenshot here, or you can also see on the website, here's the metadata. We have the actual open data portal website gives us a title and an author, and we can see this is CC0. So this is dedicated to the public domain. Cool. Does my attribution make sense? Feel free to put in the chat yes or no, or you can do a reaction if you thumbs up or something. We've got a couple of yeses. What do other people think? I don't want to give it away yet. Depends if the links work. Yeah, that is a good point. Seems okay. Yes, I think this is a good attribution, not just because I wrote it. There's other ways you could write it. You don't have to put the word data set here. But if we go through our tassel, I have the title of the data set here. This title is a link, so it is linked directly to that link I put in the chat where you can find the data set. I have an author here. Now the author happens to be listed as the same as sort of the institution. So I just have it once. If this were a person's name, I might have put author Shanna Hollich from Transportiomet. Because the open data portal has this really handy thing where it links the institution and gives you more info about it, I have that link here as the author link. So if I click on the author name like I just did, in this version I have it takes me to the page on the open data portal where you can learn a little bit more about what this organization is and see all the other data sets that they've uploaded. If you'd rather instead link directly to their website, you could do that. I just thought this was handy. And I gotta stop closing tabs because it takes away my sharing. Sorry about that. Now we're back. So yeah, I have a title, I have the author, I have linked to the source, and I have the license terms. This was released under CC0. Some people will say licensed under CC0. It's fine. I mean, technically, as we talked about, CC0 is not a license, it's a legal tool. the word police are not going to come and arrest you because you wrote the word licensed. You'll see that, it's fine. But I typically say released under CC0 or published under CC0. I will also note again here that CC0 legally, technically, does not always require attribution. But countries with strong moral rights, like most of the countries in the EU, require attribution anyway. Lots of our societal norms and professional standards require that we cite our sources. So it's best practice to do that. Attribution doesn't hurt. If somebody has deliberately and explicitly said, I don't want to be associated with this work, please do not ever name me, then okay, don't attribute them. But those cases are very rare. You will know if it happens. In general, even if it's under CC0, it's nice to just say, hey, I didn't make this up out of my own head. I got it from these other people. Let's give them credit for all the hard work they did. Okay, so I have another example. Again, I'm going to ask you to put in the chat. What do we think about this attribution? There are some really obvious things about this attribution that I'm hoping you'll put in the chat. But there are some other things too. Oh, let me give you the link to where you can find this in the portal. This is actually one of the ones I looked at a little earlier also. So here we have some city plans from a city I'm sure I will mispronounce. The metadata is all here. We have a title here in the metadata. We have an author and the department they work for. This one is licensed CC BY, so CC Attribution 4.0 International. So now we know, especially, not only is attribution a good idea, because it's the polite thing to do, but it's required legally from the license. So I gave it a shot. This is not like the world's worst attribution, but it's not great. As people noticed, one of the obvious things is there are no links. And, I know you can't click on my screen, but links show up in orange on my PowerPoint slides. And there's no orange on this slide. I also didn't credit the author, which is kind of the most important part of attribution. I have a title, so that's cool. But there's no author and there's no source. I put the license there, so that's also useful. You will see attributions that look like this, but this could be better. So a lot of you, some of you have already noted in the link or in the chat how we can make it better, but I will show you the example. Here is a much better attribution. Again, you don't have to do it in this exact style. It doesn't have to be worded in this exact way. But this is all the information you would ideally include. Now, when I look at this, I see somebody use this data set. I now have all the information I could ever want or hope for. I have the title of the data set, and this links directly to this page on the Open Data Portal where I can get to the data set. Awesome. It's licensed CC BY 4.0 International, and I linked to the actual license deed so people know what that means now. And I added the author information. And I will note here that I put both the author's personal information because there was a name. I want to give credit to Carmo here. But also I included the institution. A lot of times in data sets, the data is really compiled and published by institutions. And it's important to acknowledge those. A lot of you, I think almost all of you are working for the Estonian government in some capacity. It's nice to give credit to whichever ministry is actually responsible for the work. One of the things I also, because I was a librarian for so long, I do a lot of work in open culture. And we just released some recommendations there that are very similar along these lines. A lot of times when people are using public domain images for museums, for example. So a museum has a very old artwork that it has faithfully digitized and put online so that lots of people can see it. Um, so maybe, we'll use the Mona Lisa again as an example. Um, Technically, that image is in the public domain. The Mona Lisa is so old, there's no copyright in it anymore. So I can do whatever I want with that picture of the Mona Lisa and make derivative works, etc. Um, but a lot of museums put a lot of time and effort into digitizing these things and making them accessible, and would really like credit for that work. So we actually recommend, I mean, not only do we generally recommend that people cite their sources. So if you're using the Mona Lisa, you should credit Leonardo da Vinci for his work. But if you're using a really good digitization, really crisp, clear digital digitization of that work, whichever museum took the time, took the equipment, put that online, is hosting it on their website. Maybe it's the Louvre in this example. It's also nice to put the Louvre in your attribution, right? Like that's where I got it from. So the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci is in the public domain. I downloaded it from the Louvre, and here's a link to the Louvre. We just, our open culture team just put together a really nice report on exactly how to do that. They basically added an I to tassel, so TASIL. The I is kind of optional, but I stands for institution, where especially if you're using resources from an institution, it's helpful to give them credit, especially in sectors that we know are often struggling or underfunded, like museums or cultural heritage institutions or other nonprofits. So yeah, we have a link here to the government institution where this data set came from. So here also we see some examples. I'm going to go back for a second. One of the reasons I picked these two examples is that they reflect the recommendations from our open climate data folks. So if we go back to that slide, remember we had option A was CC0, but like, hey, attribute us, give credit where credit is due. And option B was CC by 4.0. And these two examples that I just kind of picked at random very nicely illustrate this. This data set is released under CC0, but attribution is a good best practice. It's just an ethical and responsible thing to do. And then here, released under CC BY, also fine. Now attribution is responsible and ethical, also a legal requirement. So let's really make sure we're doing it. But that we've included all the elements we need. So are there any questions about using CC licensed data? The vast majority of the data you find, so let's put it this way. I think something like 95% of the data in the open data portal is CC licensed. The vast majority of that CC licensed data that you're going to find is probably CC0 or CC BY. But you will find some other things. You might find, some non-commercially licensed data. Again, we talked about how if the underlying data isn't eligible for copyright because it's just facts, the data set, it might have copyright, it might not. If it doesn't have copyright, you don't technically need to follow that non-commercial restriction. But if you can, again, it just sort of seems like the ethical thing to do, right? Like the author, the publisher of that data has clearly communicated their desires. So if you can respect their wishes, it's a good idea to do that. Um, okay. So we started started the afternoon talking about copyright. We talked about all the different CC licenses. Um, there are some things that there's some like more advanced CC license stuff that we don't really have the time to get into, although they'll be in the resources. You'll be able to see some more things because there's sometimes some strange things happen when you combine multiple CC license data sets and you use them together. Um, Sometimes there isn't. How you combine them matters. So sometimes when you combine multiple works, what you're actually doing is making an adaptation or a derivative work. So if you're completely combining them together and they can't really be separated back out, then what you've done is what we often call a remix at CC, but what copyright law often calls a type of adaptation or derivative. In that case, you need to make sure that all the data sets you're using allow you to make derivatives. So like don't use a non-derivative resource if you're making a derivative. And you need to make sure they're compatible. So like if one of those things you're mixing together is non-commercial, then the whole thing needs to be used non-commercially, even if the other stuff doesn't have that restriction. I'm not going to get into that too much. Um, One of the reasons that we recommend CC0, and if not CC BY, especially for data, is because those two allow for the maximum use and reuse. A lot of times when you're working with data, you are pulling in lots of different types of data and you're manipulating it in certain ways, or you're writing code and doing calculations. You're combining them into new data sets and analyzing them in new ways. And it can be hard to kind of draw the line between, well, is this really an adaptation or is it, maybe I'm just, compiling the two together and they're just sequential and it's very easy to separate them back out, in which case their individual licenses apply and it's fine. Um, you don't have to worry about any of that with CC0 or CC BY. You are free to use and reuse the data in any way you see fit. You can mix it in any way that you need to, manipulate it, analyze it, um, put it into Python or R and write all your code to clean the data, to do whatever it is that you need to do with that data without worrying about these extra restrictions. So that's really important, helpful. Okay, I don't see any questions. I'm going to leave an awkward silence here in case anyone wants to unmute and ask a question. Okay, we're starting to wind down. Couple other things I want to mention and some big takeaways. Oh, this is a good question that just came into the chat. The Clarin licenses were mentioned. Do I have any recommendations regarding whether choosing either CC or Clarin or other license types for linguistic resources such as text or speech corpora? I work for CC, so I'm always going to tell you to choose CC licenses for anything that's not software. Creative Commons licenses are the global standard. They are used all over the world. They are by far the most widely used open license on several billions of works. We know they're legally enforceable, and we know that there's a nonprofit organization and an entire global community that stores these licenses and makes sure that they're up to date and that they're useful. I can't speak to the Clarin licenses. I am not familiar with them. I looked at them a little bit in preparation for this. To me, they look a little more complicated than the CC licenses, a little harder to kind of communicate to folks. And they also contain some things that are more like an end user license agreement. sort of the terms of use you click through when you're making accounts online, for example, um, which are things that are not really a copyright license. There's kind of some other stuff that they seem to do, but I'm not a lawyer and I'm not an expert on Clarin, so I'm not sure about that. I would say it's entirely possible. Remember that CC licenses are non-exclusive. So you could technically use both. And if you work in a field where Clarin licenses are the norm, but you also want to share that work in with other audiences that may be more used to CC licenses, you might want to take a look and see, somebody mentioned that some of the Clarin licenses um, are actually, I can't find it in the chat now. Somebody had mentioned earlier that the Clarin licenses are actually like relatable, like many of them are very similar to certain CC licenses. So if you find one where the terms match, you might want to mark your work with both and just say, for the people who understand Clarin licenses, here it is. But CC licenses are a little more widely used. So for those people who find that more useful, I could put that there also. I believe the Clarin licenses, they also appeared to be non-exclusive, so that would be okay. Um, the one thing I know slightly more about, although I'm still not an expert, are software licenses. So I mentioned that the vast majority of licenses that I found in the Estonian Open Data Portal, and that, in meetings running up to this training, we were told, oh, mostly CC licenses, but there was a list of other licenses. You will find some data sets and some things in the data portal and in other data portals with other types of licenses. With the exception of Clarin, all the other licenses I found used in the open data portal are software licenses. So new is really common. MIT license is really common. There's a BSD license, and a really good source, if you are interested in open source licenses, opensource.org is a really great place to look up what the specifics of what all these licenses are. We, as I mentioned before, the CC licenses were not designed for software. So I actually think I didn't see any specific, I didn't look for exactly which resources in the portal are licensed with these software licenses, but assuming that they're software, this is a good idea. The CC licenses were not built for software. There are currently more than 100 open source software licenses that exist in the world. So these are some of the most common ones that I put on the screen. I actually have this in the notes, so I'll put this here. These are links to the licenses that are mentioned, the GPL, the AGPL, MIT, et cetera, in case anyone's interested in looking at these. These licenses are all intended for software, but they're kind of only intended for software. They don't work great for things that aren't software. So we strongly discourage publishing software or code under a CC license. And instead, we actually send people to that opensource.org link and say, hey, you should use one of these OSI approved, these open source initiative approved licenses. And a lot of the ones listed here are really good options. But we do also strongly encourage people to CC license the stuff that goes along with software, but isn't software. So a lot of times when you're uploading software, you will have a README file or other text documentation. You might have some other data or databases or images, music, artwork that goes along with your software code. And the software licenses don't always cover those sorts of things as fully and completely as the CC licenses do. If we get down into the nitty gritty of the legal code. So it is a best practice. I see it all the time. I'm not a huge software coder. I know a little bit. I do have a master's degree in data analytics, so I know just enough coding to analyze my data and just enough to be dangerous. But on GitHub and other code repositories, I see it very, very common to see both types of licenses, where it's very common to see, the software code is licensed GPL 3.0, and all the associated documentation is licensed CC BY 4.0. I see that as a best practice, and I see it very common. I don't know, when you're uploading things to the open data portal, I don't know how, probably in the description somewhere is where you'd kind of have to note that, one license applies to this part, another license might apply to these parts. But that's a very common practice. So yes, you will occasionally run into some other things, like Clarin, which I do know is an EU-based tool, so probably more common in the EU. One of the reasons I'm not based in the EU, so I don't run into it as often, but you guys might. But the major takeaways, again, I work for Creative Commons. I'm obviously a little bit biased, but the CC licenses are the global standard. They've held up in court, and they've been around for a long time. So the software licenses actually have been around longer. A lot of these, like GPL, I think, developed in the 90s, maybe, the 1990s. And Creative Commons licenses came into existence in 2001 or 2002. We actually took a lot of inspiration from those software licenses. We're like, oh, there's like, you can do like the software people are doing it. There's open source software. Can we do that for other stuff too? And so we did. There are some other open license things I've seen out there, but they're just not as robust. They haven't been around as long. They haven't always been tested as fully. And I don't always know if there's like an organization behind it that's actually updating it. And so like, I recommend the CC licenses because it does have all those things. And like I mentioned, they're non-exclusive, they're fully compatible with a wide range of uses. So I find it to be one of the simplest and clearest options, with the big exception being that there's better tools for software. Don't use us for software, but use us for other stuff. So what did I want to do? Oh, I wanted to show you a little bit more about your own portal that you probably already know. So, all right, we talked a little bit about, I'm not an expert on the portal. I'm not going to go too in depth into how it works and how you can share things in it. But it was very easy for me as a novice, as someone who's never been there before and who doesn't speak Estonian, to very quickly get to a data set. I could very easily find a category, open a data set, download it, and boom, I have data. And all that metadata was there. It was very easy for me to see, okay, this is CC licensed. These are the terms. Here's the author. Here's where I can get more information about where this data came from, which is great. Your open data portal also has this really nice open data licensing guide. I just put the link in the chat, and I'm going to share the tab where I have that open. This is actually pretty good. So this is the kind of stuff like CC will often work with governments to make these kinds of documents. And, there's some stuff in here that maybe could be more comprehensive. But really, this is a very good start. So if you haven't ever looked at this open data licensing guide, I would take a look at it. This guide is intended for folks like you to clarify how open data works and what it is. And a lot of the things that we talked about today, I was very happy to see are mentioned here in this guide. So things like, hey, legally, copyright says you can share open data, but also make sure you're looking at like privacy concerns, that you're following the requirements of the GDPR, for example. There's sometimes more to think about than just copyright. That's useful to know. Um, it talks about, you know, exactly what is licensed and what isn't, the sorts of things that are copyrightable. I really like the section about why do we want to license open data, right? And this is one of the things um, that we mentioned very briefly at the beginning, and that we can get into a little bit more. Um, but but frankly, sometimes I talk to audiences who need a little bit of convincing. You know, why do we want to share data? Like, who cares? I get the sense that you all are already on board, so I don't have to convince you as much. Um, you know, you're already working with open data. You have a data portal. You understand how important it is for the public to be able to use and reuse knowledge and information, um, and how important that sharing is. I mean, this is how we solve problems. This is how we work together. Um, Especially, you know, a big thing in the US that I have seen in other countries too is a lot of this government data is publicly funded. So the public is paying for this data and the work that's going into it, through their taxes or and through levies and other things. So they should have access to the things they're paying for, right? And this is one of the things I didn't mention this, but I meant to. When we were talking about finding and using CC licensed resources, we talked about there's some directories online where you can find open access research, for example. Um, but one of the important things to note is that more and more funders, so people who fund research, sometimes that's governments, sometimes it's private foundations like the Bill Gates Foundation. Um, a lot more of those funders are actually requiring that any of the data or the research that is being done through projects that they fund be shared openly with a CC license, um, or something compatible. Again, if it's software, an open source initiative approved license. But this is where we're seeing this more and more. So any research that's done in the US that is funded through federal government grants, is required to be published open access. The Bill Gates Foundation, I mentioned them because they have an open access policy that says if we're going to give you money to fund your work, the products of your work, the research that you do, needs to be published openly. People need to have access to it. And a lot of those folks started doing that because they realized that it's really important for other researchers and other scientists to be able to have access to these things and to build on them. Um, you know, I'll use another climate example, but you know, if some brilliant climate researcher wants to read some new research, a new article that just came out, um, and they go to find it online and they hit a paywall. You know, they get to a website. Elsevier says you have to pay $40 to download this article. Um, Not every researcher has funding. Not every researcher can afford $40 for every single article they need. And they're not always affiliated with a big university or a library system or an organization that already is paying Elsevier tens of thousands of dollars to have access to their database. So now that person's research is stalled. That person's research is incomplete. They don't have access to the things they need to solve the problems they have. And the scientific world loses. Um, you know, they don't get to hear from what could be a very important and useful voice. And that's a shame. We don't really want to see that in society, right? Um, okay, so back to the data guide. It talks about the licenses that are available for open data licensing. Um, it gives some more information about the CC licenses. I definitely think this is a very useful resource. I want to make sure you all know that it's there. Um, I don't know who put this together, but I'm very grateful for them. Sophia, if you know who put this together, please pass along my thanks. Um, this is very useful stuff. So this is another resource for you to have as you're using your data, as you're making visualizations, as you're doing your research and relying on that stuff. So some key takeaways. When you're sharing your data, it's really important to try to keep things as reusable as possible. Um, provide enough information to make it easier for someone else to use your data later on. And if your data uses somebody else's data, provide really clear attributions so that, again, anyone who's using it knows, okay, so these are the parts that Shanna did, but, Anna did, it was based on this other data set from Anna, and so I want to go find that one, and now I can. And so I can see the original one, and I can see the new thing, and you just want to try to put yourself in the mindset, what is somebody who's actually using and reusing this data? What are their needs going to be? And have I communicated everything they need to know as clearly as I can? There's something I've heard described as the minimum licensing principle or the minimum licenses principle, which essentially is don't add a bunch of unnecessary additional restrictions if you don't need to. So if, don't choose a really restrictive CC license if that's not important to you. Most data is perfectly fine being licensed CC0 or CC BY. A lot of it doesn't have really useful commercial uses anyway. You're not going to get a lot of extra protection from a lot of additional restrictions. In some jurisdictions, there isn't even copyright on data, so those people can probably just do things with it anyway. We don't want to make things more complicated than they need to be, right? So if you don't need to put additional restrictions on your data, then consider licensing it with the most open license that you can do. And again, this makes things easier for a user and a reuser. I like to remind people to think beyond copyright, even though it's my job to talk about copyright. And that's what we did for most of the afternoon. But it's important to think about things like ethics and privacy when we're talking about data sharing and use. I think this is my library background. Libraries in the US, we are trained to care a lot about privacy and user rights. And I spent a lot of time teaching undergraduate college students, for example, what happens to their data when they do things on the internet, and why they should, maybe think about changing some settings, or just understanding how their data is being scraped and used on the internet. Uh, these sorts of things are important, especially, if this applies to you, you generally know this, but especially folks working with like healthcare data, privacy is really important when you're dealing with data that comes from human subjects. You want to make sure your data is anonymized, is de-identified as much as it can be, and that you have the full consent of your participants to share their data. Again, these are things that exist outside of copyright. There's a lot of talk about artificial intelligence tools right now, for example. Um, and a lot of these things that people are concerned about and rightly concerned about um, they live in this sort of ethics privacy area. They might not necessarily be copyright things, but they're things like, well, wait a second, you know, do I have the right to opt out of my data being used in certain ways? Like, can I give informed consent about the way my data is being used? A lot of times when we do scientific research, we have very strict guidelines for how we use human data. And so a lot of this stuff you're already going to be thinking about long before you get to the place where you're publishing your data. But it's just important to keep these things in mind. I think it's helpful to choose tools that people are already familiar with, like CC licenses. And again, for software, those software licenses, um, you want to make things as easy as possible for users and reusers. And metadata is really important. So if you know what that is, great. At the very least, when you're uploading your data to a repository and you get that form to fill out where it asks for all this information and you're like, wow, I don't have time and I don't want to do this, please do it. Please fill out the form and add all those metadata values. They're very important for people to have all the information they need. And a lot of those metadata values are also helpful in searching. Um, so for example, a lot of data portals and repositories will allow you to search based on the type of license, based on the license terms. We saw this in Openverse, for example, where you could filter your search to just public domain images or just things that are licensed CC by NC. Um, the metadata is what makes that possible. So make sure that you're describing your things as clearly and completely as you can. Okay, that is the main part of what I wanted to talk to you about today. So now we're at questions. We're not completely done. I do have a few other things like, more resources and some upcoming opportunities to tell you about. But I want to leave lots of time here for folks to ask questions if they have any questions, or if there's anything that you were hoping that I would talk about, but I didn't talk about it yet. Tell me what it is. You can put those in the chat, or again, I will leave a nice long awkward silence if anyone wants to unmute and share any thoughts, comments, questions about anything that we talked about this afternoon. Here is your chance. Okay. I don't hear any questions, but do still put them in the chat if you're typing. Please keep typing. I remember when I visited Estonia, um, we started, I was with an orchestra and we did a tour, performed in a couple of different places. And we started in Lithuania and then took a bus through Latvia and then from Riga into Tallinn. And our tour guide said, Estonians will not talk to you on the street. I said, what? And they said, well, in America, people will just smile at you and they'll just start conversations with you out of nowhere. And Estonians won't do that. They're not rude. They just don't do that. And I said, okay, that's fine. Um, I'm a very talkative person, but you don't have to be. Um, okay, a couple other things. And then you'll probably get a few minutes of your afternoon back, which you will probably appreciate. I do want to note, and I'm going to send Sophia these slides so that you have these links. So a big part of my job at Creative Commons is running our CC certificate program. And part of those online courses, we do these live synchronous webinars. And some of them, two of them, involve question and answer sessions with actual lawyers. So I have a lot of answers, but I'm not an actual lawyer. So we have two of them coming up next month in July. And one of them in particular, the one that's 9 a.m. my time, is going to be about 1600 your time, about 4 p.m. So manageable. The other one's going to be pretty late at night for you. But These are open to all of our certificate participants, but we would also encourage and welcome you to attend these sessions if you would like to. Even if you don't have questions you want to ask, it can be very useful to just listen in and hear other people and what their questions are and see what actual lawyers say. And the reason we do two of them, so one is with the lead of our CCUS chapter. So the CC community has chapters in, I think, 90 different countries. I neglected to look if Estonia has a CC chapter yet. I'm trying to look right now and I'm talking really slowly so that I can look before I get to the end of the sentence. It took too long. No, Estonia does not have its own chapter yet. There is a CC Finland. So if you want to cross the water, the next closest, well, CC Norway, Sweden, Finland. The next closest is probably Poland. But yeah, so we do two of these Q&A sessions with two different lawyers. So one is the lead of our CCUS chapter. The other one is our actual Creative Commons in-house lawyer, a full-time staff person like me, our general counsel. We like to do two of these because you'll get slightly different answers to your questions, especially if you have a really tricky question or a really complicated case. You'll get two different perspectives. So those can also be a really nice opportunity for you all. We do record these Q&A sessions and we just started posting them on our YouTube page. So you will see those. It takes me a few days to get the video cleaned up and uploaded to YouTube. But if you follow Creative Commons on YouTube, you will also see these on YouTube. So that can be another useful resource. We do have a question in the chat. So I want to see, public sector institutions are often interested in whether and how much of their data is used from an open data portal. Today, we don't have a very good overview of it. What would be your recommendations if or how this overview could be obtained? First of all, I just realized that I was telling you all about these webinars and I wasn't showing you any information about the webinars. So let me share the tab that has the information about the webinars. Now you should be able to see that. And I will also put these links in the chat for anyone who's interested. And again, this will be on the slides. But to answer this question about how your data is used, this is tricky. So Creative Commons does not, we don't ask people to register their license anywhere. So we don't have a really good way to track like who's using CC licenses and how. It's a thing we've talked about for a number of years. There are some technical challenges and that sort of thing. But one thing I noticed, again, I'm not an expert and I don't know much about it, but I'm going to go back to the Estonian Open Data Portal. Because when I was clicking around, one thing I did notice is that there's this statistics. And it tells you about, data sets that were added, but there was this tab for data set downloads that I quite liked. And it does actually, at least this open data portal does seem to be able to track at least how many times a data set was downloaded. So I'm assuming it's keeping track of, how many people clicked on the link. And displays counts, I guess, from the last 30 days. So if you as an institution, and I don't know how this works, Sophia might be able to speak to this. For sure, I'm sure you could email her and get more information. I didn't create an account, so I'm not able to log in. But I think as an institution here, you can create an account on the Open Data Portal, and that will give you the information and the ability to upload your data sets and also give you access to some of these statistics about which of your data sets are being downloaded, how often are they being downloaded, when's the last time they were downloaded.
Thanks for explanation. I guess the Lizzie was mostly asking about the kind of from the licensing perspective. So, as you mentioned, that you, as a Creative Commons, do not collect anywhere, like in anywhere all materials which were licensed with Creative Commons licenses. So it's not possible to get them from somewhere. But yeah, yeah. Is there any tools licenses provides for kind of getting information on the data reuse?
Not really. Like I said, it's a thing we've been looking at. We're exploring. We've talked to some software, some technology companies about maybe building a tool that kind of allows us to track that sort of thing for people who want to track that sort of thing. But there's a lot of privacy concerns that we have and that some other folks in our community have about tracking that sort of thing. Um, one of the things I might recommend, so like the things we do. So for example, your public sector institution, you want to know how your data is being used, what's out there, who's using it, how it's being used. We don't track the CC licenses, but we're also interested in how are CC licenses being used and who's using them. Um, so we scrape some data from the web. So like we can go onto Flickr and see how many CC licensed images are in the Flickr database. That helps give us an idea. We can go to Wikimedia Commons and see how many CC licensed things are in Wikimedia Commons. We can go to YouTube. So one of the things I think that might be most useful, certainly if your data is publicly available online, like on your website, you can track the clicks that it gets. So you'll at least know which data sets are being clicked on and downloaded. That's a thing you can do on your website. And so you'll know at least which ones are popular. The only other thing I could think of is that because attribution is a requirement, or at least a very strong suggestion, you could potentially search for your institution's name on the open web and see if you can find people who have attributed you and see which data sets they're using and how they're using it. Um, that requires considerable work. It's not an easy answer. I'm sorry, I don't have a good, easy answer for this one. But a lot of times, you know, honestly, what we end up doing is a lot of surveys and a lot of asking our community, like, hey, which resources are you using? What data is useful to you? What data are you using and how are you using it? So I know a lot of public sector institutions would love to be able to track that. We don't have a way to do that, unfortunately. Um, but if anybody comes up with any good ideas, let me know.
Yeah, just maybe to add one thought. Ots, our chief data officer, I know, for example, he tried to just search for some data sets in research papers and some, I don't know, physicists using Google Scholar, just inserting the names of the different data sets. So it kind of reminds, no, because it's also related to offer rights. So maybe, yeah, this can be also a way, not directly using maybe SSC license, but at the same time, also you're kind of stating the offer.
Yeah, Google Scholar is a good example. Like they do some tracking and can do some metrics um, that might be useful. So there might be something you can sort of find, some information you can find there. It's a good point. These are excellent questions so far. And thank you for your input. Other questions? Okay. Make sure I'm sharing the tab I want to share. Oh, I like it when people give ideas. One possibility could be to create a standard referencing system, for example, standard text from the clipboard to refer to the source. I did notice, for example, I only just noticed this today while I was showing it to you. But the Openverse, so when we went to openverse.org, let me see if I can find it. This is, again, this isn't like a CC, this is just like a general web tracking thing. So this isn't specific to CC, but I noticed, for example, that, let's look at another kitten picture. That they give you this attribution statement that you can just cut and paste. Um, and I noticed it here in the link. It's only in the license link for some reason. I'll show this to you. I'll put it in the chat. The Openverse link that it gives you actually includes this ref equals Openverse at the end. This is one way, this is one just web general internet tool that can be used to kind of track where clicks come from. So when someone clicks on that link, assuming that we have everything configured correctly, we'd be able to tell, and Openverse should be able to tell sort of how many of those clicks are coming from Openverse specifically. So some link tracking like that might be another way to do this. But yeah, I am definitely not an expert in this particular area. But if anyone wants more information there, do feel free to send me an email, and I can kind of get you in touch with people who might know more. Which, do keep putting questions in the chat. But speaking of email, I'll just show you my last couple of slides here because they're mostly contact information and more resources for you. So if you would like to learn more, we do a lot of training, stuff like this, stuff that's not like this, more interactive stuff if you want. We have monthly office hours with our legal team. So if you can't make those 2 webinars, for example, every month, I think it's on the 3rd Friday of the month, you'll find it online. Our legal team just sits online and answers questions. We also do a fair bit of consulting work. If you know an institution who's looking to implement open policy or do some more work in that area, excuse me one moment. Okay, sorry about that. I'm getting over a cold and I was doing great all morning. But mostly wanted to share with you my contact information. So I will put my email address in the chat. But yes, even after today, if you have questions or thoughts, or you just want to get more involved in the CC community, excuse me. Okay, if you want to get more involved in CC, or you're interested in learning anything else, do feel free to reach out. Okay, I think my coughing is telling me that our training time is almost over. Thank you so much for being such a good audience today. I will take a look. If there are any last minute questions in the chat, do please put those in there. But otherwise, you are welcome to email me at any time. Sophia will share the recording. Good question about examples from court practice. What have been the effects of copyright exploitation? This is where the legal database is probably going to be the most useful. Let me find that link again. So again, this varies widely from country to country. In the US, some people make a lot of money by taking copyright claims to court. So you can sue for monetary damages. In other places, and probably more commonly in the US, the usual court remedy is just that the person stops using the thing. So for example, and again, I'm sorry that I don't know how this works in Estonia exactly, although some of this is outlined in the Copyright Act. But for example, I used to work with folks who would worry about, oh, what happens if I accidentally break copyright law? I infringed somebody's copyright, or I used something that I wasn't supposed to use in a way I wasn't supposed to use it, and I didn't know. Am I going to lose $1 million? In the US, at least, the answer is probably not, and certainly not right away. The first thing that happens is somebody reaches out to you and says, hey, you're using my copyrighted material and I didn't give you permission. I don't like this. And the next thing that happens is usually a formal cease and desist letter, is what we call it, where they formally, outline, you are doing this thing, it's against the law, you have to stop. On the internet, sometimes these are called takedown notices, so you might have heard of those. But generally it's take the thing down. And then once you've taken the thing down, it's over. Like, you're done. It does not usually go anywhere from there. The places where, you read about these big copyright court cases happen when, somebody is infringing copyright, and they refuse to take the thing down, or they refuse to stop doing it. And then somebody says, okay, well, my only choice now is to take you to court and make you, and have a judge make you. And that's where you start to see um, legal monetary damages being paid, or some other compensation. So that's the effects I'm familiar with anyway. That's typically how it works when copyright is infringed. If anybody happens to know, I know we have some legal folks around. You can absolutely share case law and legal scholarship to our legal database. We're always looking for folks who would like to submit cases and articles, especially, see, Creative Commons is a global company, but a lot of us do come from North America and Western Europe. So we're always especially, a lot of the staff anyway, come from those places. So we're always especially looking for folks who can help give us more insight into the global South, into other continents that are maybe not as super well represented on our staff. So yeah. Sophia, I'm happy to turn it back to you to kind of wrap up.
Yeah, thank you so much for this session, because together with many people from our audience, I also wasn't so knowledgeable